Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this next commentary track in my series on the James Bond films will deal with the second of the unofficial films outside the official Eon-produced James Bond film series. This, of course, means we will be discussing 1983's Never Say Never Again, which I affectionately like to refer to as 1983's Never Say Never Again. It's a film that, of course, has a definite reputation for those who are aware of it. It seems more and more people nowadays only know of it possibly as an obscurity or just simply group it in with the rest of the official films. But I find it's becoming more and more obscure, which isn't helped by the fact that when Eon quietly acquired the rights to both it and the Charles K. Feldman 1967 Casino Royale spoof film to get everything finally under the same Eon umbrella, they have quietly let both films go out of print. So now it is very much unavailable outside of one or two appearances on some streaming services, and you will have a great deal of expense in trying to track a copy down, for example, of the film on Blu-ray. Of course, the film is a product of a long-running legal nightmare that started all the way back in the 1950s with Ian Fleming's many failed attempts to get a James Bond film off the ground, eventually partnering with the up-and-coming Kevin McClory, who had wanted to break into films but had only had certain experience in the industry and was just starting to make his own initial first films as a director. They worked on a story process that eventually started to become a script, eventually bringing in the great screenwriter Jack Whittingham, who helped bash it into a more appropriate screenplay form. So between the three, Ian Fleming, Kevin McClory, and Jack Whittingham, they came up with the story treatment Latitude 78 degrees west, which of course became Thunderball. Eventually, even though they did get close to a certain extent in getting a feature film made, it just never really came to fruition. And while it was on the back burner for a while, Fleming did what he did a handful of times and used what was seemingly abandoned or what was not going to work for a James Bond adaptation and turned it into one of his yearly novels that he wrote in Jamaica at his home Goldeneye. So the novel Thunderball was released in 1961. McClory saw an advance copy and immediately sued Fleming for plagiarizing the work they had created together and essentially stealing the concept. Of course, Fleming had not really considered this and did make many embellishments on his own, I should add. Most of the best stuff in the Thunderball novel is entirely Fleming, and the novel itself does suffer from the fact it was based on a screen treatment and is not completely 100% a Fleming original. But anyway, this meant that when the deal was made and Eon was created, when Harry Saltzman made the initial deal to acquire the James Bond novels and then partnered with Cubby Broccoli and they formed Eon to produce the official films, that meant that Thunderball was the other story besides Casino Royale that was not part of the deal, seeing as Thunderball was still tied up in the high courts of London. Eventually that case was settled out of court. Fleming was in very ill health, and it is generally regarded as that court case really hastened his untimely death in 1964. He was not a very well man to begin with, and the intensity of the court case really hastened his death and his various illnesses and things. Of course, originally Thunderball was meant to be the initial Bond film, but and actually Dick Maybaum wrote a treatment. So his 1961 script for Thunderball was written long before there ever was an official series or an established formula, which meant that when they made the film in 1965, that was what they started with, and that was one of the many reasons why Thunderball has always felt slightly disjointed as a film, because there was a little degree of that still floating around that original Maybaum 1961 script attempt. The end result of the court case settling out of court was that Kevin McClory wound up with the rights not only to the Thunderball story, but the screen rights to make a film adaptation of Thunderball, and he also retained the rights to the Spectre organization and the character of Ernst Stavro Blofeld, even though it is really highly debatable how he wound up with that anyway. And of course, poor Jack Whittingham and his estate and family never really got much of anything ever, and he is usually the party who is ignored or glossed over entirely when this entire story is recounted. And without Jack Whittingham, the actual Thunderball story would have never really have gotten off the ground outside of the initial ideas bashed around by McClory with Fleming, and I'm sure the Thunderball novel would have turned out much differently. So Whittingham deserves a great deal of credit for getting the overall plot structure in place, because he was a great screenwriter and renowned for being able to really have nice, tight plotting. And all of this is detailed extremely well in the essential book reference work, The Battle for Bond, which if you haven't read, I highly encourage all Bond fans to read it. It is the most in-depth anyone has ever gone into this struggle to get James Bond on the screen and the odyssey of Thunderball and Kevin McClory and how all this came to be. I'm merely glossing over this in the introduction to this commentary because it is absolutely necessary to have some historical background. So to speed things up a little bit, McClory wound up partnering with Eon and making a deal with Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, which resulted in the 1965 film adaptation of Thunderball. The other part of the deal was that McClory could not do anything with his rights for the next 10 years. So that meant he could not do anything with his James Bond rights and got producing credit on Thunderball and a substantial payment for his rights and services as they were on the film, and then had to sit on his Thunderball rights until 1975. This was the best they could come up with at the time, and obviously thinking that they would hopefully be still making films in 10 years, but probably not James Bond films, because even at this time, Bond's longevity was not even a figment in the imagination of even Cubby Broccoli. But 1975 rolls around, and they've been in pre-production on The Spy Who Loved Me, and Cubby Broccoli's worst fear comes back in the form of Kevin McClory, who is pretty much as soon as the correct date rolls around, he announces his intention to make a James Bond film, and it originally wound up under the title of Warhead, or Warhead 1975, and he would make big press announcements and trade papers and things, and the Warhead title stuck around for a while. And then, of course, as time went on, it would update to Warhead 75, Warhead 77, Warhead 78, so on and so forth. But it ultimately never really went anywhere, because everybody and their brother knew that, Bond was, at that time, Cubby Broccoli's baby, because Harry Saltzman had left after the Band with the Golden Gun, and they had parted ways. And there was no way any studio was going to back a rival Bond production, because you would be competing with the tried and true official Eon James Bond films. And Broccoli fought tooth and nail in the courts to try and avoid a rival Bond production, feeling quite rightly that the 1967 Feldman-produced Casino Royale spoof film had hurt and damaged the image of James Bond, and also probably hurt the box office of You Only Live Twice a little bit, which it most likely did, but that was more a case of the whole spy mania craze starting to wane. But what Broccoli feared most was a rival Bond production, when Bond was now his sole producing effort as a sole producer. He was no longer partnered with Harry Saltzman, and Bond had pretty much become his life's work. So the last thing anyone would want in that scenario is a rival production headed by Kevin McClory, who had been a thorn in Broccoli's side ever since the initial deal had been made with Harry Saltzman for all the other books. Of course, the other reason why no studio wanted to touch McClory's project is they still found the legal situation very dubious, even though it was pretty much sound that McClory had the rights to doing an adaptation of the James Bond novel Thunderball. There were so many elements that were so closely tied to what was part of the official film series that it became a legal minefield, and Broccoli, again, fought tooth and nail, using as much legal minutia as humanly possible to try and at least, he knew he probably most likely couldn't stop the rival production, but at least stave it off as long as possible, and try to keep it from try to ensure that it was as different from the films that Eon made as humanly possible. Reading into the various McClory projects over the years, both before and after Never Say Never Again, are fascinating, and it's a real shame that we aren't able to actually read the screenplay drafts, because the Warhead scripts essentially were developed and written by both Lynn Dayton, and Sean Connery was brought in various guises to give his own input, and this was really the first sort of inkling of Connery being lured back. And again, it was not to actually star in the film originally; it was to give his insight, and who would have the greatest insight into the world of James Bond than the person who was widely seen, and still to this day is widely seen, as being the greatest actor of that particular role. It was a actually smart idea in a lot of ways, and Connery has always been undervalued for his intellect as both an actor and a person, and I think it was a very interesting idea. And of course, Lynn Dayton had apparently done some work on the initial stages of the From Russia with Love drafts, and was a contemporary of Fleming's, and was well-noted, famous spy novelist in his own right. The elements we do know of the original Warhead scripts, while they can get into the outlandish, they do at least have a nice larger-than-life quality to them, although the whole notion of the film ending in the New York sewers and alligators in a battle with around the Statue of Liberty, it was a bit over the top, and it definitely did have some inklings of The Spy Who Loved Me in it, and there was a little bit of back and forth between McClory and Broccoli about each project sort of ripping off the other. The Spy Who Loved Me had been the product of a very torturous development process where nobody could get any good ideas together, and of course originally it was going to be a Spectre film, but of course McClory popped up and that had to get removed, so it became quickly changed from Blofeld to Karl Stromberg. And if you look it's very obvious that it was originally supposed to be Spectre, right down to the army inside the giant Ken Adams set with color matching uniforms and such. Ultimately, the Warhead projects fell apart and McClory could not find any backing. So this project once again fell by the wayside, really, until Jack Schwartzman entered the picture, who had been an entertainment lawyer and who was always interested in challenging projects and finding legal loopholes, apparently. So he encountered McClory and looked into it and realized that McClory did have a legal precedent and a right to make an adaptation of Thunderball, and basically took it upon himself to use it as a springboard to finally break into film production, which is apparently something he had been wanting to do, and he decided to make it the first film he actually produced. So McClory is still there in the wings, but it's really Jack Schwartzman who takes over from this point, and with his legal know-how was able to convince enough financial backers and then eventually convince Warner Brothers to put up some of the financing to do the distribution and pick up the film. So the film has a sort of interesting, odd, quasi-independent status. It's not technically a studio film, but it was ultimately distributed by Warner Brothers. And more films were doing this by this point in time, or under smaller film companies that would eventually get picked up for distribution by a major studio. Schwartzman and company got together and eventually started piecing together their production team, and immediately the legal cases started as Cubby Broccoli and Eon jumped into the foray and tried to stop the rival production, and basically they wound up just keeping everyone tied up in court as much as possible, but it was really trying to fight a losing battle because Schwartzman was able to prove that McClory did have the rights to remake Thunderball, the novel. And so then it became a constant battle developing the film that became Never Say Never Again, but having to stress over every single description, line of dialogue, or sequence in the film to make sure that it could not possibly steal, lift, borrow, or be in any way similar to anything in an official Eon-produced James Bond film. This factor did not help anyone and really strained the creative process. But the overall, even bigger problem, and that in and of itself is a gigantic problem, but the largest hurdle the production faced and ultimately did not overcome was the fact that Schwarzenegger himself was a first-time producer and was not experienced in this field. So anytime a issue was raised or a problem was faced, the producer was not really there to take the hands-on role that he should have been. It also didn't help that, once again, Schwartzman found himself constantly, even in the middle of production, tied up in court with Eon's lawyers. So these court battles kept going even into the production of the film. And eventually the film wound up overshooting its budget, and Schwartzman had to start paying the budget out of his own pocket. And the production went wildly off course and became quite chaotic and very, very much a matter of people really tearing their hair out and trying to get the film finished on time. They were also, of course, rewriting the film over the course of the entire production, which did not help matters. In the process of getting everyone together, Connery was approached again and took a active hands-on role, as he did on the Kevin McClory Warhead projects. But essentially the offer was made and a very substantial amount of money was put up, and Connery decided that he would reassume the role of James Bond one more time in this Thunderball remake. So this would be 12 years after his last Eon film, Diamonds Are Forever, in 1971. And Connery was attracted by the idea of playing an older Bond to give him something to do as an actor, something different, something to play off of, a new springboard to work from. And you can see that in the performance. That's what he's excited by, and it very much predates what he would do with Henry Jones Sr. in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, for example. The problem is, unfortunately, this is all lost in the fact that the script just goes all over the place. Originally, they had Lorenzo Semple Jr. writing, who had recently done the fantastic 1980 Flash Gordon for Dino De Laurentiis. He was most famous for being the creative brain behind the 1966 William Dozer, Adam West Batman television series and its intensive dose of satire. I would love to be able to read Semple's original drafts. Basically, they were reworked and rewritten with Connery's input, and then Irvin Kershner was brought on board to direct, and Kershner requested many rewrites, and so did Jack Schwartzman, and Semple sort of followed what they wanted, and then Connery wasn't happy with those rewrites, and essentially, in Semple's version, he was let go as sort of the scapegoat, but he did provide pretty much of the framework and how they were going to try to do Thunderball the novel and keep to the same plot structure very strictly to avoid Eon complaining about anything, but he never really got to finesse it or jazz it up, as most writers would put it. And also, apparently, he did do more of his own material in the earlier drafts that he worked on and got Connery's input over. So it would be fascinating to be able to read those, but unfortunately, they're nowhere online, and I've never seen any elements from them. Pretty late in the production, the pre-production process, they decided to bring in new writers, and so that's when we got to the writing team of Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais, who had written for many British sitcoms and were known as being a pair of very witty writers. They did have prior Bond history because they did do some under-the-table little contributions to Moonraker, of all films. And, of course, if you know Moonraker and its reputation and its overdosing in humor in random places, you can start to make some connections to what you see in Never Say Never Again, and it makes a little bit of sense. Of course, it's unknown exactly what they contributed to Moonraker, but when I found out that little factoid, that set off the light bulb in my head. They claim that most of the opening half of the film, the first 40 minutes to an hour, is mostly all their material. I think that is probably very true. The first half has definitely got more of this internal wit running along to it, and a lot of really fantastic jabs at the official Bond series that I've always been surprised that Cubby Broccoli and Eon didn't get mad at the fact that they were doing a version of Q and Moneypenny and stuff, and I always figured they would complain about that and say that's too much like our films, but they were very much a satirical look at many classical Bond elements. And then after this, after about the halfway point, when the film starts to slip down a little, particularly by the time of the climax, because it feels very much a formulaic plot, and there's no jazzing anything up. There's very little meat on the dramatic bones. So essentially, after a certain point, I think what you're left with is more of the sort of plot structure that Semple had come up with, and then the stuff that Clement and La Frenais were not able to have the time to develop. And I think it definitely shows in the film. And everyone involved in the production really comes away with the fact that it was extremely compromised, not just from the legal hurdles with Eon, having to stick with the novel, but also the internal politics going on, and Schwartzman not being a hands-on producer at all and being very much inexperienced as a film producer, ultimately leaving Connery himself to give the quote, "It was a bloody Mickey Mouse operation." And that is a direct quote. I think you get the sense that Connery himself was frustrated. He claimed that if it hadn't been for his own efforts carrying the film and the efforts of David Tomblin, the first assistant director, who was a legendary first assistant director at the time, that the film would have never gotten finished. I also think Kershner was probably not the best choice for director, even though he was fresh off of The Empire Strikes Back. The original choice for director was apparently Richard Donner, who would have been an outstanding choice, but Donner, I think wisely, for himself, he passed on it. He didn't feel it was the right thing for him or the right thing to do, to be honest. And then other people were suggested. Kershner had worked with Connery before, so they had a rapport, and Connery did have director approval. Kershner does do some interesting things and did obviously care about trying to give the material something fresh, and obviously trying to not do an official Eon Bond knockoff, but to do a older Bond and a more grounded Bond. But ultimately, the film, It has a flatness inherent to it. It has many, many, many problems. Almost all of them go back to the fact that the script was never entirely finished and was written by two different sets of writers with different tones, and the film was essentially ruined by its internal politics and then having to meet a hard release date. On top of all this, it was going to be released in 1983 up against the 13th official Eon film, Roger Moore's sixth Bond, OCTOPUSSY, and the press had a field day naming the summer of '83 the Battle of the Bonds, and the entire marketing campaign of Never Say Never Again was entirely about Connery's return and little or nothing else. Ultimately, the film was released slightly after OCTOPUSSY, which did outgross it in both the US and worldwide by a small but relatively significant margin. But both films got decent enough to positive reviews, which is very surprising when you look at the actual film. But if you go back and read the reviews, all of them are about Connery and his performance and his return, and little else is actually paid attention to. So the film did do what it set out to do in terms of getting a positive reception and making a decent amount at the box office, but it is perhaps the greatest definition of a mixed bag. There are great elements of wit in it. Connery's lead performance is outstanding, as is the lead villain performance of Klaus Maria Brandauer. He and Connery are easily, by far and large, the single best things in the entire film, along with some other great satirical pokes at the James Bond official Eon films, and a number of the comic relief characters do really work effectively well. But ultimately, it has this flatness that almost, I hate to use this phrase, but it pops up every time. It has the flatness in a lot of spots of, unfortunately, being like a TV movie of the 1980s, which is not something you want to apply to a James Bond film, and particularly a film that did have a substantial budget and did shoot all over the world. But just to reference Moonraker once again, that film did the same thing, had a large, extravagant budget, but you see all of Moonraker's budget on the screen, and you feel the extravagance in every single image. Whereas in Never Say Never Again, it frequently looks flat, and that's really a shame because, of course, the film did basically take most of the production crew right off of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The film was shot by the legendary British cinematographer Douglas Slocombe, and looking at this, there is some nice composition, but the whole film was so rushed and so harried that even having one of the great cinematographers couldn't really achieve very much. So this is a lot of what I'll be getting into in the rest of this track, but I did want to give some of the historical background to start with for those coming in who have no real knowledge or don't know too terribly much about the whole background and lead up to the film, which ultimately did shoot it in the foot. It compromised it from the very beginning and leads most people to this day to still think that the entire production was a terrible idea, which I can agree with in a number of ways. But I do think the biggest problem is the fact that while saying 100% they were trying to not do a James Bond film like the official Eon films, the whole film feels like what someone else's idea of a James Bond film should be or is. Like another studio was able to do their own James Bond film, and it's what some studio executive thought a James Bond film was. What they should have done, and a point I will try to make over the course of this entire commentary track, was to run with this idea of the older Bond like Connery was originally attracted to and be as different as possible. Be a smaller film if they had to. Be a darker, more character-driven suspense drama or suspense thriller like James Bond originally started as. And in a way, you could get back closer to the original Ian Fleming spirit that the Eon films were doing at this point. All the 80s films were actively doing this. Essentially, they did sort of follow the lead of the Eon Bond films of the 80s and the Roger Moore era, even though they were actively trying not to. And all of the various political infighting within the production and the politics going on of all the different factions and the lack of communication actually wound up affecting sequences in the film, which were compromised by things just turning up on the set incompleted. So every problem you may have with the film can be explained by its production. It is absolutely 100% true that this film was absolutely wrecked by its production. However, I say all of this, and as a diehard Bond fan, this is a film I've had to come to terms with over my life and many, many rewatches. I now rewatch it every year after watching the original series. It's a film I've come to, I don't really groan with it, but I sort of go along with it, and it has its own charms. It's not terrible. It's not a bad film. There are great things in it, but it is completely compromised in every single way. So its pleasures and its highlights are almost always dragged back down by, unfortunately, this flatness, this languid quality, which is not helped by, of course, having no elements of the official Eon series that all of us fans have come to know and love and appreciate. I don't mind them being absent, but when everything else is so monotonous and flat and languid and lacks pacing and energy, and the wit is only on display in short, inspired little bursts, very infrequently, and there are decidedly less action sequences to move things along. I can go down a list, but it is a film that is unfortunately compromised by the nature of its production, which was haphazard to say the least. So that's my little introductory spiel out of the way. Again, I try to give at least some background at the start of these, and this one you really need the background of Kevin McClory and the Thunderball saga. Again, you must read The Battle for Bond if you want to know more information about the whole Kevin McClory Thunderball saga and the lead up to this film, Never Say Never Again. Now, for the technical notes, unfortunately, the film is out of print on DVD and Blu-ray. However, if you do want to sync up a copy of the film, do go ahead and look at the audio options if you have a later version and select the original 2.0 Dolby Surround encoded mix of the film. The 5.1 mix is just an up mix of that track, and this film has a very uninspired, very dull sound mix to begin with. It almost sounds, unfortunately, mono at times. It is so pitifully limp in its usage of any additional channel information, but I do feel the original 2.0 Matrix stereo is better than the 5.1 discrete up mix. The best sounding version, and again, the mix itself is no sonic delight, so that's not saying very much, but the best sounding version on disc to date is the Warner Brothers Letterbox Laserdisc release, released in the US, I believe, in 1995. That's the best sounding version I've found, but on the DVD and Blu-ray, they added a 5.1 up mix, so I would suggest if you have a physical copy of one of those, select the original 2.0 mix if you're going to watch along with this commentary. So as always, if you do want to watch along with me as I commentate over Never Say Never Again, definitely go ahead and go to whichever copy of the film you have and cue it up after the opening logos. Most now just have an Orion logo on the opening for various reasons. So cue it up in the black area just before you see the opening crisscrossing 007 logos that look almost like old NTSC scan lines from a CRT screen. But yeah, if you cue it up there and we do the count in, we should be in relatively the same place outside of frame speed differences in other territories. Again, these tracks are not professionally recorded, so please do bear with me. But if we start there just after the opening logos, we should all be in about the same place, and hopefully you'll be able to figure out whatever I'm talking about. There shouldn't be too much of a discrepancy if you skip past the opening logos. I should also probably preface this commentary track that I do occasionally lapse into my own personal Sean Connery impressions just in my everyday life. I don't claim to be an impressionist, but I just fall into certain voices, a lot of them Bond-related. I still quote this film like the other Bond films because I've seen it an ungodly number of times, of course. To this day, I find myself calling to someone, or if I have to call out to someone, sometimes without thinking, I will do a terrible version of Klaus Maria Brandauer and be like, Kovac! Kovac! Kovac, yes! As we see Largo call to Kovac many times in the film, his henchman, essentially the version of Thunderball's Dr. Coots character. But at certain points in this commentary track, I might fall into my Sean voice. And of course, doing the older Sean in this era, I find sometimes a little bit easier and just something I lapse into. So if that does happen, I just feel compelled to sometimes. So I figured I would preface this track by doing that because I still feel my Connery voice is it's still in pretty good shape. You're marvelously well equipped. Thank you, James. So are you. Hard or soft? C'est la vie. Such is life. So with that, let's jump into it and do the countdown. So let's have our copies synced up in that area just past the opening studio logos. So we'll do the countdown in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Press play now. All right, so we're here in the opening title with these, again, very bizarre crisscrossing 007 logos as an attempt to sort of have a Maurice Binder type gun barrel and pre-title sequence. And we jump into the theme song performed by Lonnie Hall, composed by Michel Legrand, who did the film score. Now, originally, there was a song submitted by the singer Phyllis Hyman, which you can hear on YouTube and other places, which is pretty good. Unfortunately, that was rejected, and they went with this song, which was laid over this opening sequence, which essentially was the film's version of a pre-title sequence. They actually improvised this while shooting in the Bahamas. That tells you they didn't even have an opening. They improvised this on the fly of this Bond in training montage, where it's revealed at the end to be an elaborate MI6 training for the rusty, aging 007. But it was, in Kirshner's words, all laid over a ticking clock, and that would amplify the intensity of the scene, which was supposed to be about action and seeing Connery's Bond once again leaping into the fray of things. But you lay this song over it with this very laid-back, almost adult contemporary, almost lounge feel to it, and it cuts a lot of the intensity of the action of Bond sneaking around and covered in sweat and in some South American-looking area on this mission, ostensibly to rescue some, I guess, wealthy heiress or something. We have very simple titles in a red font, and it's a very underwhelming opening, but I must admit, people make fun of the song. People say it's terrible. I made fun of it terribly as a kid. I used to mime along, still do somewhat, actually. But as a song, it's kind of won me over the years. It's an earworm for sure. It gets stuck in your head. But I do think its placement here actually works in a bizarre way because it gets you into the rhythm of the film being much slower, much more laid back, and sort of, unfortunately, establishes this sort of vibe of flatness, even though you have Connery going around doing all these various things, right down to going across on the power lines and using a blowgun and garroting one guard. And of course, he's really getting into it. And if this is just a training exercise, and you see already he's a bit older, he's got some graying at the temples, but he's still throwing himself into it. And it must be said that Connery, in every moment of this film, sells his performance at 250%. He is fully committed, not just because he had a large paycheck, but because he was involved creatively and actually appreciated, which is something that he felt he did not get in the official Eon films, particularly towards the end. Now, as soon as the stun grenade goes off, the song cuts out. And we get this, which it's simple enough, but the fact that this is not staged very well and it's mostly carried out in a master shot, and then we go into this fight sequence, I think it does definitely already tell you, cue you in that something is off. And of course, that's revealed to be a training sequence. Definitely that makes sense. But also, most of the action in this film is not staged very well. The fighting choreography is fine, but the staging is very much played out in master shots, and it just feels very very centered in the frame, and the actual location feels very open. It's always been underwhelming to me, which the whole film should be described as underwhelming, if I'm perfectly honest. Well, it's this moment here, and of course the girl is played by Wendy Leach, who is a famous stunt woman and the daughter of the famous stunt coordinator and assistant director George Leach, who of course had been in and involved in many official James Bond films, including Thunderball, of course, where he actually he appears on screen as one of Largo's crew. Now we immediately see this is a training sequence because we see what we just saw as part of actual VHS footage. So obviously there was a hidden camcorder inside the film camera, if you really want to split hairs. But this introduces us to this film's version of M on MI6. This is a new M played by Edward Fox as a total foppish bureaucrat, and Bond is seen as sort of the last of the old guard, where his instincts aren't trusted, and Bond finds himself in the new world of the 1980s, where he is literally the old dog. This is sort of the element that it gets lost over the course of the film, gets downplayed, but this is sort of what Connery was attracted to. This is the new tack that they're going after. Edward Fox's M usually gets criticized by most Bond fans, but it's actually a great performance in trying to balance sort of a believable bureaucratic for lack of a better term, idiot, and a slightly comedic performance. You're supposed to not always take him completely seriously because the audience is supposed to be on Bond's side. And you can tell that Bond doesn't take any of this seriously, and he can't believe that he's forced to deal with this after all the years of being the world's greatest secret agent. This is what he finds himself in. There are little elements like this that do creep up in this era of the James Bond continuation novels. And I feel the film's biggest shortcoming is they didn't take advantage of the then newly created John Gardner era of James Bond continuation novels that started with License Renewed in 1981. Even though the film was stuck in adapting Thunderball again and essentially remaking the film, I think it would have been very smart to use a similar tack to what John Gardner did in updating and modernizing Ian Fleming's James Bond for the 1980s. Most of the best passages in that book, License Renewed, are about Bond adapting to a more politicized MI6 and right down to even figuring out what gun to use because the Walther PPK has been retired. Of course, Bond does not use a PPK in this film because that would be too much like the Eon series. That also goes to his choice of vehicle. He cannot drive an Aston Martin DB5. So here, very brilliantly, they put Bond back in a Bentley, which we had not seen on screen since From Russia with Love 20 years beforehand. But of course, Fleming's Bond famously drove a variety of original Bentleys that he absolutely loved and cared for, and it was always terrible when they would get destroyed in the novels and he would get another one. It wasn't until Goldfinger that he switched to, as what Fleming put, a Aston Martin DB3. So having that in the film was a great touch. The film is filled with a number of knowing nods for diehard Bond fans, like we all are. But also it gives Bond a chance to make a crack about age. The attendant at Shrubland's comments that they don't make him like this anymore. Bond looks approvingly and says it's still in pretty good shape. And that nicely cuts into this sequence where he sees ostensibly the Dr. Wayne character that is in the novel and the original film. We don't really see in the original Thunderball film. But the head doctor of Shrublands and talking about Bond's various battle scars over the years, which is a humorous idea that a doctor would see Bond's physique and be like, oh my God, what do you do for a living? How are you still alive? But it allows Bond to make the same crack about his body being still in pretty good shape, just like his old Bentley. And we get the little bit of comedy with the nurse and the first instance of the urine beaker that's going to come in very handy. So now we're introducing the Fiona Volpe character in the form of Fatima Blush, played by Barbara Carrera, who is another of the highlights of the film. She definitely has the most energetic performance outside of Connery and Brandauer. But most of this was improvised on the set in terms of building up the character and using her when they didn't really have anything else to do, because there was quite a bit of on-set improvisation in the process of making this film. This is taking the place of Largo entering the Spectre headquarters in the original film and going into the gigantic Ken Adams set. Here we don't have any of that. Most of this film was shot in practical locations or sets designed to look like practical locations. Unfortunately, that means we don't have a lot of the high gloss or glamour of the Eon films, which is something you might miss. It would work if the film wasn't so lackadaisical in its pacing. Something else that is wasted is Max von Sydow here as Blofeld, which is an absolutely inspired, perfect dream casting for Blofeld. And he is unfortunately completely wasted in the film. He has a handful of scenes here in Spectre HQ, which ultimately all seem to be inside this one small room. And he narrates the video footage, that the package that's sent to the NATO HQ in a little bit when all the bureaucrats find out that the nuclear warheads have been stolen. But outside of that, that's all he has in the film. Apparently they did shoot more that was deleted from the film, but it's such a shame that he's totally wasted. And of course, had they made a second film somehow with McClory's rights and this sort of universe they created with this film, you can imagine Connery's Bond after this film somehow going up against von Sydow's Blofeld, which seems like a match made in heaven, but it just wasn't to be. So now we're introduced to the film's version of Largo. Now it is Maximilian Largo, and played by the wonderful Klaus Maria Brandauer. Another small change We see the brother-sister relationship of Domino and her RAF, but of course here, American Air Force brother, keeping the Petacci name, the surname of Domino from the original novel, which she changed it from, which of course helps to explain why Largo doesn't know that they're actually related in the novel. But here he is at Shrublands and being taken care of by his nurse, Fatima, and that's how they get in at Shrublands, instead of having the whole business with Count Lippe and having the surgically altered double like we get in the Thunderball original film adaptation. Also must be mentioned here that this is the film's version of Pat Fearing, who is, of course, also in the original Thunderball novel, which explains her presence here in the film. But it's interesting to note that the way the film plays around with keeping the plastic surgery element, we don't have the double as we have in the original 1965 Eon film, but they do keep the plastic surgery element with the whole bit of Petacci having his eye surgically implanted with a duplicate of the President of the United States retina patterns. So he'll be able to break in at the airbase into the secure zone and actually switch out and authorize the nuclear warheads. So they did what happened in the novel, where the brother was simply a turncoat and could be bribed and is ultimately killed by Spectre. But they also keep a little bit of the film. There's a few little bits like that, where if Broccoli and Eon really wanted to make a legal case that they couldn't pull anything from the 1965 film, well, there are some bits that definitely do sort of crop up, but I think they just eventually, after a point, just kind of let bygones be bygones, because you couldn't possibly have this film be 100% not have absolutely any ties to the 1965 Thunderball. It was just bound to happen somehow. This is a sort of different play on how Bond romances Patricia Fearing. Here he does it by smuggling in all of the finer elements of life that would not be allowed at Shrublands. And Connery has fun with the way he plays this. And of course, the idea that Bond would go to Shrublands, be forced to go in there, but not go in without his own creature comforts that he smuggles in, is an amusing idea. Again, the first half of this film is loaded with more of these little bits of sly humor and wit, and I think this really helps to cement the second team of writers' claim that again, this being Dick Clement and Ian Le Frenay, that most of their stuff is visible and more concentrated in the first half of the film. And they specifically cited everything at Shrublands and in the Bahamas. So again, I think it does show a marked difference to I'd say more of probably the first 2/3, and this also was because they were rewriting as fast as they possibly could, and the production would literally get to points where they didn't have things to shoot, and they were having to make up things, or they were having to piece together things on the actual set itself. It's also interesting here, another notable difference is Bond getting into the thick of things is once again by his own curiosity and his own brain, and using his instincts to tell him that something is going on. Obviously, being in a health resort and hearing and seeing a nurse beating the living crap out of her charge, definitely not the thing to be doing. But what's interesting is that there's no direct physical connection up to this point, whereas in the original story and in the 1965 film, Bond, in the film especially, Bond sees the Tong Society tattoo on Lippe's forearm and notices it, and then decides to start snooping, partly because his instincts are awakened, but also because he's bored out of his ever-loving mind. And by doing this and breaking into Lippe's suite and being observed, that's enough for Lippe to try and kill him on the traction table. And it starts a sort of cat and mouse game that we see get furthered when Bond discovers them trying to hide the body of Derval. Well, we don't have any of that personal connection here. we get the fight with Lippe in a little bit, but we don't have that direct back and forth, almost in certain ways childish one-upsmanship between Bond and Lippe that we do in Fleming's original novel and the original film. In fact, one of my absolute favorite moments in the entirety of the original 1965 film is when Bond gets his revenge on Lippe by roasting him alive in the sweatbox cabinet and locking him in, and then the next time we see him, he's got a thick sunburn. But this scene is also important because it establishes Pitachi having to practice at the eye machine, and Bond sees the dual flag emblem that is later revealed as the official logo of Largo's terrestrial business empire. Of course, it begs the question, it probably wouldn't be very wise for Fatima to be going around carrying Largo swag merchandise, but apparently that's not in the Spectre 101 handbook, how to carry out plots. I do like the reveal of Bond's face in the night vision. He's hidden away properly in the shadows where he can't be seen, but new technology is what gives him away. I really like that touch that Bond is indefeatable in the old ways, but he is fighting on a new battleground where technology is starting to overwhelm the old days of spycraft. But the film does go to great lengths to establish that technology cannot ever completely replace the man on the ground, that the human element and the human ability to question and to probe and to look beyond the obvious, even if it seems like proven fact. This is what makes Bond special. This is what always makes him stand out, that he trusts his instincts. That is why he is always the senior man of the 3 00 agents who work at MI6 at any given time. I think also this plays into Connery coming back and everyone having all the preconceived back history with this character and Connery's performance. And it's great to see Bond using his intelligence, because his intelligence and his instincts are his greatest weapon. They are greater than any Q gadget. So we see him find the matches with Largo's logo on it, which of course helps him to to get led to Maximilian Largo after the Shrubland sequence. Get this nice bit here of Lippe, played by Pat Roach, infiltrating Shrublands. This was all, again, shot in a real practical location in an English manner, with some bits of stage work here and there intersposed. But this turns into a nice fight sequence, obviously the best fight sequence in the film. And we get it started with a nice little bit of suspense. We see Lippe come in, and he's taken over as the floor buffer. We don't see his face. We see him carefully approach Bond. And by having Bond at a weightlifting machine, it is once again giving us the idea that he's still working at being physically fit. He's still capable of doing things. He's still intelligent, but he's still physically able to move around in at least some of the way we're accustomed to seeing. But the best part of this fight sequence is it takes all of that and throws it out the window and rubs it in our faces that this Bond is older. And here Lippe is a extremely strong, very big guy, but he doesn't have any major feature of, say, a traditional Bond villain, even though there are some nods to Oddjob here, especially with the barbells. Because Bond will do as Connery's Bond obviously always does, by using his wits and everything at his fingertips. So he goes for the barbells, and they bounce off Lippe's chest. This seems a deliberate nod to Goldfinger and Connery's Bond throwing the gold bars, which bounce off of Oddjob's chest in the final Fort Knox fight. And then almost an unintentional nod to Jaws, with Lippe punching through the little bench table here. Now, I've said this fight is the best in the film, and I really do think it is. But the problem is it goes on for an absurd amount of time. While I like the sort of, they're kind of wandering around this manor house, this whole fight was improvised, and they didn't have an ending for the longest time, and it was very much slapped on. But I think the problem is the attempt to introduce humor in this sequence borders on the cartoonish. Like here, Bond pops out behind the door and he smashed Lippe's nose, which seems directly ripped out of a classic Warner Brothers cartoon almost. Now, this is an amusing little bit with the fight going unobserved by the elderly patients of the health spa, all too interested in a sports game. But it is a little on the too goofy side. Again, there's this tendency to slip into cartoonish humor, which you get again here with Bond slipping the mop in between the stairs to make Lippe trip. But it is picked back up again because they smash into the kitchen and they do a nice bit of damage, and the fight gets escalated even more when Lippe pulls out the, I don't even know exactly what it is. It's a sort of metallic, small bullwhip that seems knife-edged, that's able to cut through metal. I've never known exactly for sure what that's supposed to be. But we see Bond still in the thick of it and trying to use everything at his disposal to get away from this guy, since he obviously, it is not possible for him to defeat him with physical means. But again, you can see how it's like they're just grasping at straws here, because they're great little bits in the fight, but the rest seems improvised. Although I do admit, this bit in the hallway here, even though Kirshner claimed it was all done in practical locations, it always looked to me like that hallway is very much the same as the hallway in the Overlook where Danny hides in The Shining when he's being chased by Jack. I don't know why. I guess just the style and design always makes me think of that. Again, this is a great fight, and you have Pat Roach, again, right in the middle of the first two Indiana Jones films, where he's most notable for all the great fight scenes that he does in those first two Indy films. And I do like how this sequence ends on a nice note of humor. I like the idea, but just the execution isn't quite there. And seeing Bond at this low status, that he's been reduced to this point of just being in absolute desperation, and then he manages to kill his foe in just this offhand sort of manner. It doesn't hit the right note, and it definitely shows that this whole scene was completely improvised on the set. And of course, we get the flashback to the urine specimen sample, and so the idea being that it was Bond's own urine that caused Lippe enough pain to back into the shelf full of glass canisters. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't even look like those wounds would be that fatal. They're just kind of, the beakers are sticking out of his back. But again, it's the best fight in the film, unfortunately. And then we immediately smash cut to M being completely frustrated and not believing Bond's story at all. And the line about caught you seducing his wife is the same sort of gag that was used in The Man with the Golden Gun when Bond asks, who would pay $1 million to have me killed? And M has the priceless response about outraged chefs, humiliated tailors, jealous husbands. The list is endless. So now we're cutting into the air base where we have the U.S. contingent. Again, an interesting switch, changing it from a NATO airbase to a American one. I don't know if that was maybe an attempt to appeal to the American market or the fact that Warner Brothers was going to distribute it. But again, it is a switch nonetheless, as is the means of switching out the nuclear warheads. In the original, of course, the training flight did actually carry nuclear weapons, meaning that the whole switching was not necessary. Of course, this means we don't have anything about the in-flight hijacking, which was one of the elements that was introduced by Jack Whittingham in the original 1950s scripting process, and is one of the most highly dramatic parts of the original Thunderball film. This sequence does have a little bit of drama because there is the timer that Patachi has to overcome in order to actually switch out the warheads, and there's a implied little bit of danger of him being caught and the base being sealed and things. But this substituting the in-flight hijacking is just, it does not achieve the same result at all. But I do like the idea, and I think the idea is perfectly sound. And of course, this gives it the film more of a high tech, almost the phrase is always used, the gee whiz factor. And of course, this being 1983, computers were being used more and more often in films, and this is one of several moments in the film where technology is used in a way to appear novel or slightly cutting edge or ahead of what was available at the time in 1983, which makes sense to a certain point. I do think all of the technological switches to computerized elements, I do think are done well. I don't mind any of them, but it just that this does not replace the hijacking sequence. And of course, when we get the equivalent of that in this film, there is no plane; it's the automated warhead rocket carriers, and we get this bit with the warheads being switched out, the red lighting to suggest danger like the interior of a submarine in wartime situations, and of course the pre-recorded voice. I like the gag that it's actually telling you what's going on, and then of course ends with the "have a nice day." And we see them being loaded on board with everyone else none the wiser. And then we have this Michel Legrand cue. I haven't mentioned Legrand's score yet, which is probably the number one thing that people complain about. Everyone loves to complain about this score as being inappropriate for this film, and they're absolutely right. It is very jarring in most places. I think that cue works okay. I don't really have a problem with the score for the most part. But Legrand was not really the original choice. The original choice was James Horner. That's who Kirshner wanted to get after hearing his work on Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. But Horner was unavailable or was just not approved by the powers that be. And eventually, in a last-minute, almost act of desperation, apparently Irvin Kershner was talking to Barbara Streisand, who was in the middle of shooting Yentl almost at the next soundstage, and she was the one who suggested maybe trying Michel Legrand. Legrand had done a sort of action spy movie before this point, which would be, for me, one of the scores of his I really do like, which was for the film Ice Station Zebra. And that, of course, has a James Bond connotation of sorts because Howard Hughes was obsessed with the film and would run it endlessly when he was living in the penthouse suite in Las Vegas and was a recluse. And that was the whole inspiration for the plot of Blofeld in Diamonds Are Forever. So, of course, the world of Bond always circles back. Now, this is the means of getting rid of Captain Bictacci. Of course, in the original novel, he is killed by Largo once he delivers the plane. He is brutally killed by Largo and his Spectre team by being cut in the throat by a stiletto and just dumped in the water. Whereas in the original film, he is memorably eliminated by Largo by being left to die with the rest of the men he killed in the drowned Vulcan bomber. Here, Fatima is used as the Spectre assassin for a major player on the field, much as Fiona is, and this scene basically takes the place of the scene in the original film where Fiona on the BSA motorcycle fires the rocket and kills Count Lippe in the Fort Thunderbird. But, of course, we're getting rid of Bictacci here. The gag being that Fatima is concerned only with her precious snake, and because she's evil, she loves snakes, and snakes and her are a pair made in heaven. Now, Carrera has such energy on screen, and she's having so much fun, and she and Kershner developed such a great rapport that they built up every one of Fatima's scenes. But the problem is that, again, there's this element of it gets almost cartoonish. Most of it I'm fine with, but she just doesn't have the same, as a character, winds up not having the same element of danger that Fiona Volpe had, that Luciano Paluzzi's performance in the original Thunderball. So I feel it's a drastic downturn from that incredible characterization in the original film. But I just hate how the Fatima character lapses into this sort of cartoonish, almost Wicked Witch of the West or Wizard of Oz quality, if you will. There are moments where she's more effective because that isn't as prevalent, but it's always there lurking under the surface of this character they created on the set. Now we're here in this sequence where we have the obvious process footage and a special effects footage of these rockets flying around. And yeah, it's a cool moment for the time, but the effects have not dated very well. There are some nice whooshes in the soundtrack. This is the most active this sound mix will ever get, is when those rockets are whooshing by. For the most part, the sound mix of this film is terribly just not effective. The sound effects are great, and actually, ironically, the great Norman Wanstall was essentially lured out of retirement to do the sound effects. Even he has commented on the very troubled nature of this production. But the actual sound mix itself absolutely pales in comparison to Octopussy, released the same year. But I do love the uses of sound here, where we have Dr. Kovacs looking at the readouts, and we hear the noises get more and more intense as the rockets are going to hit water, because we don't actually see them hit the water, which was a great dramatic moment in the original 1965 film when we saw the actual crash of the bomber, and then we saw it sinking. Well, here we only see the props when they hit the actual seabed. I guess when they shot this, probably in the Bahamas. But again, it's just I like that we see it on the monitor and we get the buildup of sound and Kovacs is watching and everything. But it's very anticlimactic when we just cut to them falling on the seafloor, and then we get this Michel Legrand cue, which is fine in its own right, but it's just very underwhelming. And it doesn't have that same level of immediacy. But I do like and really appreciate how Largo isn't even there. He's just flying around and has the great line, "Put them on ice," and he smiles. Even in his first appearances like that, you can tell this Largo is completely unhinged. He is not a typical sane person, and his nonchalance is just as threatening as say another villain character going completely over the top. Now we're here in the meeting room of diplomats, and they've basically gotten the video package from Spectre, and we have Max von Sydow giving a very low-key but very threatening warning as he's reading this. And I like that they focus on the cat, and the cat is basically the star of this video, and the cat's reactions. I like that idea, although that's another moment that Eon could have said, well, that's from our film, so you can't do that. I like that they take the time to show the serial numbers of the bombs, which they mention in Thunderball, but of course in Thunderball they were dealing with a tape that was sent to the British government. There are some moments of this film that are, of course, dated because it was made in the 1980s, and you can tell that here from some of the decor, the look, and the fact that the actual projection screen being used is curved. And I love the fact that this ends on the cat, like, just licking its paw, and then they managed to get the bit of it looking right at the camera, and then cut to stock footage of an atomic explosion, which gives away that Spectre will, do what it claims without them actually spelling it out in words. I like that this Blofeld doesn't have to spell it out in words. But then, of course, you have all the politicians and bureaucrats totally losing it. But unfortunately, when they all get around here, I wonder if this is supposed to be comedic. I think it kind of is, because these people are all seen as completely useless, just as the M character is supposed to be completely useless. And they're all going around and saying, oh, well, how could this have happened? And then the American fellow gets up, who, of course, is played by the same actor who will turn up in the next Eon film, A View to a Kill, playing the Zoran's oil man, Connolly. But I like how they're all like, oh, our fail-safes have never failed to this point. So it's supposed to be inherently humorous, but some of the dialogue here is just woefully terrible, especially the woman with the French accent here, when she gets up and says, if this gets out, it will cause a worldwide panic. It's just like, that's too on the nose. It's just, but again, it is trying to carry across this idea as established by M that even the politicians are completely useless, and only someone of Bond's stature can sift through this mess because of his intelligence and his instincts and his old world charm. And I really like this scene where Bond is essentially in the records department, and he's following his own instincts and looking up this Largo character, who, of course, he doesn't know at this point is going to be the man he's going after for this crisis that he's not even aware of yet. And this actually is a Ian Fleming moment. This is what happens in the Goldfinger novel, where Bond is looking at Goldfinger on the identigraph after what happens in the opening of the novel, which gets replicated in the film with Goldfinger cheating at cards. And only then is Bond called to M's office and told to investigate Goldfinger, and that leaves Bond to literally start laughing. And then M asks, "Why are you laughing?" And then Bond has to explain, "I was just looking at him for the past 6 hours in the records department." So now we see the flying saucer for the first time. Largo, of course, has a yacht once again. The flying saucer being the English literal translation of the Disco Volante, as it was originally. Of course, this boat was entirely real and, interestingly, owned by Khashoggi, the arms dealer at the time. And they made this deal with this notorious arms dealer to use his gigantic yacht. And, again, this is a practical location. But then all the interiors in this office sort of complex of Largo's is, of course, a set. I like the design of it. It's just, it's trying to have maybe a little bit of the more fanciful James Bond style with a dash of maybe the Ken Adam touch, but of course keeping it on a very small, realistic scale without ever going for the giant Ken Adam showstopper sets. I also really like this scene where Bond and M are still talking about the mission at hand and sort of playing detective and figuring out how could this have happened, what's the best tack for Bond to go off on, what should his mission parameters be, even though M is still foppish and he doesn't believe in Bond. And we have this great moment where Bond and sort of this other character, who I've never been exactly sure, but I suppose is supposed to take the place of Bill Tanner, who is M's chief of staff in the Fleming novels, who we rarely ever see in the films and is Bond's only great friend in the service. But I like that Bond is the one who, of course, comes up with the notion, could Patachi have broken in and somehow maybe used a false eye of sorts? And then the joke being that the audience goes, "Oh, yes, you've got it." And then M is just like, "Oh, don't be an idiot, 007. That's the joke. And of course, it once again shows that it's Bond's instincts that should be believed. And unfortunately, no one believes in him, and they all consider him, well, I hate to use it, but it's true. In this film, James Bond is considered by everyone a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War. Does that sound a little bit familiar? So there are a lot of things that are happening in this film that Eon themselves would wind up doing, particularly in GoldenEye in 1995. Of course, it's much more under the surface. It's not played as obviously as it is in GoldenEye, where M literally has the sexist, misogynist dinosaur line. But that line's become a criticism of the character overall, and a line that everybody knows and likes to bring up. And it's interesting to note that you really see it here in Never Say Never Again, probably for the first time. That whole idea of an older Bond, a Bond who's sort of out of step with the rest of the world, and it's popped up in GoldenEye, and it's an idea that's been used and really done to death now in a lot of films and a lot of franchises that decide to come back. Like, for example, that's what they do in Live Free or Die Hard, the fourth Die Hard film. Now we're introduced to Largo being voyeur with this really creepy but interesting character note of him being able to spy in on Domino and her dance studio. And then this also introduces us in a very interesting way to the Domino character in the film, played by Kim Basinger. And she is a complete innocent, which is fine, and that's been done in certain Bond stories. Fleming did it, and some of the films did it, but Domino is one of the best female characters that Fleming wrote, and Claudine Auger and the 1965 Eon Thunderball film is one of the best Bond women in the series. And it's really unfortunate that all that has been reduced to a complete innocent who is a damsel in distress throughout the entire film, and being played by Kim Basinger at this point, who was very, very early in her acting career and was extremely nervous throughout the whole shoot, and seems to be, unfortunately, cast more for her looks than her acting ability. I've always said that one of the great issues with the official films is the fact that, especially compared to Fleming's original novels, most of the female characters are not necessarily underwritten, but they're only developed to a certain point, and they wouldn't always go after great actresses. That of course, being a James Bond film, the female roles are secondary supporting roles to begin with. But taking one of the strongest female characters in the Bond series and recasting her in this light is just, it's rather unfortunate. And basing her, unfortunately, in the film comes across as really showing her an experience. She has this frequent deer in the headlights look that I always just, it always stops the film for me. I mean, she's effective, but Kirshner really had to struggle at getting her to relax, especially working with Brandauer here, who was a very strong actor, and working with Connery, who was, as Kirshner rightly said, was already an icon. So you had Basinger here working in between these two extremely, these powerhouses on either side. So it obviously was not an easy thing to do. I must mention there, that's a nice scene where we see that this Domino obviously apparently loves this version of Largo and is crazy about him, but even she knows at that point there's something unhinged about him, and he literally says he'll cut her throat. And you can tell that he actually means it. This brings us to the film's version of Q, and this nice little introduction where Bond is surprised. Although if you look closely, it looks like he is using almost a Walther PPK at that point with silencer attached. This is one of those scenes where it does make me think of Gardner's License Renewed, because there is a long passage where Bond is struggling to figure out how to use a new weapon and struggling to figure out what to do with that version of Q Branch. This is one of the best satirical jabs at the official Bond series, that this version of Q is underfunded to the point that he works in a basement where they won't run the HVAC system, and it keeps him perpetually cold, and he's got a sinus infection from hell, which even affects his voice. And he complains to the point that if they made him an offer, he would defect to the CIA, and then even goes on about how many ice cream flavors they have in their cafeteria, which just that idea alone I find endearing. So again, there is no Q's lab in the original Thunderball novel, so this is another invention from the Eon films. So there are elements like this, just like this film's version of Moneypenny, where Eon could have said, hey, you can't do that. But again, I think after a point, they just totally just were like, we can't possibly win. But here, you can tell everybody's having fun, poking fun, and doing a sort of satirical take. One of the best gags here, Q takes Bond's old watch and breaks it. And we hear the breaking glass. And then his lines about bureaucrats running the old place. Can't do anything unless the computer gives you the go-ahead. I hope we're going to have some gratuitous sex and violence. I hope so, too. That's the key line of the film, of course. And then here's an example of Eon lifting something from this film, maybe intentionally, maybe not. Bond asking about the gadget, and of course, Q reveals it to be his inhaler for a sinus infection. Well, that's the same gag we see in GoldenEye with Bond picking up the submarine sandwich. And Q says, don't touch that, that's my lunch. Bond getting to have a joke at Q's expense, saying, I'm going to the Bahamas. Lucky Bloody You, a nice match cut which builds on that laugh. So that's one of the best edits in the film. And we cut to Bond in the Bahamas, looking wonderful in a nice sort of tropical suit. Again, definite tinges of Bond walking around Nassau and Thunderball 18 years before. But here you can again see that this is an older Bond. He's just sort of taking in the sights a little bit and acclimatizing himself, and immediately runs into Valerie Leon, making her... Well, she, of course, appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me in a brief part. It's unfortunate she's not really in the film outside of these one or two scenes and is sort of a secondary character, because I think she would have been... I do think she would have been a better Domino than Kim Basinger. And she does have nice chemistry with Sean on screen. And now we're introduced to the major comedic element of this sequence in the form of Rowan Atkinson in his first major film as Nigel Smallfawcett, the local representative of the British Embassy who takes it upon himself to try and use some elements of spycraft because he's dealing with James Bond. And he's completely hopeless at it and hates himself for it and only cares about being a local bureaucrat and the tourist trade. I absolutely adore this character. I know some people hate this character, but I find what Atkinson does with this role just absolutely spot on perfect. I think it's the right element of humor to leave Bond both exasperated and slightly bemused at the ridiculousness of the situation that he finds himself in, and then how he needles him into ending the scene on a note of humor, where with the bit about take advantage of the natural cover. And of course, Sean underplays it beautifully as the straight man of the scene. I wish this character was in this film more. I really adore this whole character, that he's just a normal bureaucrat, and all he's worried about is that James Bond is going to destroy the tourist trade. And again, you see in Connery's face, he just brings his hand together. Do I look like the sort of person who would jeopardize that? Frankly, yes. There are some who think that this character was sort of taken off and in some sort of alternate universe became the Johnny English character that has been the Rowan Atkinson's character in a series of spy spoof films. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I think maybe some of the spark of that idea had come from this character. Honestly, I wish it was the Nigel Smallfawcett movie, because I think that would have been a much better film, because it would have been much wittier than those films we eventually got, which are fine for what they are, I suppose. Now we get Bond being introduced to Fatima for the first time as she's water skiing around. It does give her a nice appearance of being, extremely physically active, and once again selling her presence as a physical threat and danger to Bond, as a very Black Widow or praying mantis type of female character that will obviously have her way with the hero before completely and enjoying his destruction. And I like the introduction, although it's rather ridiculous that she just water skis up into the bar. But I like that they make her immediately crash into Bond, who doesn't even spill a drop of his martini and has the perfect line handy. There's one thing, and Fatima is always that. She is always direct. That is what I like about her. Again, I don't mean to sound like I'm criticizing Carrera's performance. She is extremely energetic and wonderful in the film. It's by far and large the role she's remembered for. That's why I hate that Kirshner lets it lapse into going over the top so much that it gets into the cartoonish. Again, another really nice line transition. Bond weighing the situation for a moment, obviously knowing that this woman is up to no good, deciding to play it anyway as Fleming's Bond, as the real Bond would do, to force the pace, as Fleming would put it, with the line, "I'm all yours." With Bond having an unbuttoned shirt and being on board a boat and going below deck, one can't but help but think of the similar scenes in 1973's Live and Let Die. I love the way that Sean plays this. He obviously knows that it's time for a tryst on the boat, but of course won't admit it. And of course immediately starts stripping down anyway, ostensibly to get into scuba gear. Which of course gives us the dialogue about, you're very well equipped, James. I'm sorry, you're frankly well equipped. So are you, James. And of course, we're talking at cross purposes here because the meaning is very clear, but not in the dialogue at all. And if this scene cut here, it would be perfect. But of course, we get this extended bit with this jazzy score cue coming in. We see the boat plowing through the water, and we see them turning around. And now we cut to underwater, and this shot of the fish, which seems artificially slowed down a bit. And then a very slightly risque shot of Carrera hanging outside inside the door frame. But we do get this cute gag of the boat tipping, them sliding down, and that being cut to match their diving into the water. It's cute, but it just undercuts the danger Bond is in at that time, and that he's choosing to literally screw around to kill time. What should be a a nice cutaway with that element of danger and the risque gets undercut by this awkward bit of, I guess, an attempted humor. And we go into the underwater sequence. She plants the Homer on him. The score stays jazzy too long, and then at least goes into a bit of a danger sting. But really does not fit the scene at all. And at least the first chunk of it. Now, this scene, I have to admit, is really incredible for the fact that it is 100% real for real with these tiger sharks, and the whole concept seems to originally come from the Lorenzo Semple drafts, but the idea that Spectre would have gotten these sharks and engineered them to have this device in them to force them to trace the homing signal and, of course, attack whoever it was attached to. Of course, it's an over-elaborate death method to get rid of James Bond. And, of course, the age-old question of why don't you just shoot him or why don't you just get rid of him? That's too easy, and Bond has to be able to escape. That's part of the inherent cliches of the form and the style. Of course, if you begin to question any of this, it's going to defy all logic. But, again, this scene, the fact that these are real tiger sharks and there are real divers in the water, of course, it's not Sean swimming around, but in the close-ups, it's Sean, and there are moments where he is quite close to sharks, which, as everyone says, is not something he wanted to do. It is actually the same scenario he found himself in on Thunderball, where the scene Ken Adam talks about, where they ran out of plexiglass in the underwater pool tunnel, and one of the sharks swam through the gap, and there's a moment in the film where you can see Connery's face of pure panic where the shark comes past him. Well, this sequence is extraordinarily hairy because these are real sharks, these are real divers in the water, and they're on this shipwreck, which, while it seems slightly controlled, anytime you have a compromised environment like this underwater, things can go horribly wrong. And, of course, it was even difficult to have the sharks here because, of course, if sharks become stagnant and they don't swim around, they won't be able to get their necessary intake through their gills, and they will die. So they had to capture these sharks and get them ready and then get them in the scene and get the scene shot quickly so then they could release the sharks again. And I love this bit where Bond manages to lock himself in the cabin, and then we see the shot of all the sharks swimming outside, and then one finally breaks in, and then we get this interesting bit where he breaks through the glass and gets back out again. So you see Bond really having to fight for it here, and also having to use his wits and piece together. Eventually, in just a moment, he'll realize that something's going on. He doesn't realize it, though, until he's managed to capture a shark and pin it down, again using his wits and not a gadget. And then he's able to see just the horrible thing that obviously Spectre has done to these sharks. And then he sees the device on the fin, which we've gotten choreographed to us by the little pinging sound effect on the soundtrack throughout this entire sequence. Then Bond is able to feel behind and then find the thankfully large enough magnetic homing device. And then in almost another nod to Thunderball, he drops it down inside the ship, which seems exactly like him leaving the Q giant motorized air tank and then dropping the grenade on the 3 Spectre frogmen in the underwater battle. Once again, we pay off an action sequence with a nice bit of comedy. This brings us back to Valerie Leon and their initial meeting. And, of course, after all that, Bond happens to have the perfect line, "You did say you'd catch me later." Then we have some local flavor, although nowhere near as elaborate as the Junkanoo staged for the original film. And then we see Fatima Blush just dancing around, having a fantastic time because she thinks she's killed James Bond. And then immediately having a sort of rom-com moment. But instead of seeing her man with another woman, she sees that the man is still alive. And there's a nice blink and you miss it gag. Not only has Bond borrowed a pair of overalls, but they've apparently caught some extremely large fish that they're able to show off. Now, I've always felt this hotel lobby was an extremely dated set, but this was a practical location, so that makes sense. One of the major issues of shooting a film mostly on practical locations is if the decor is dated to a particular time, that's going to date your film extremely quickly. And that combined with the unfortunately mostly very flat looking photography, which isn't helped by a lot of the underwhelming video transfers this film has received over the years, doesn't help its overall flat feeling and this sort of drabness that it has. I would make the argument that even the location scenes in Key West and License to Kill 1989 have more oomph and impact to them than the scenes here shot on location in the Bahamas in practical locations. Now, this sets up the nicely executed gag that's a reversal where we're led to believe that Fatima has planted a bomb in Bond's hotel room and they're on the bed making love, and it sets up the suspense that the bomb's going to go off. And now a small faucet interrupts at the perfect wrong time for a nice bit of comedy, which is compounded by the fact that we still think a bomb is under the bed, and everyone is screaming, "Get out of there, there's a bomb under the bed," which is how you execute any suspense scene. Now, the reveal of the bomb going off and that they're actually in her hotel room is executed nicely, but it's a very simple, tried and true old technique of thrillers and suspense films. And this is something that Kirshner will do several times in the film, this being the most notable. But of course, when you've done it one time, when you then repeat it several more times in the same film, it loses its effectiveness. I do love the shot and the composition here of Fatima activating the bomb, going off behind her, and not reacting to it at all, and not even really blinking. That's very nicely done. Again, paying off another scene with a one-liner, and then cutting to Nice. So we've left the Bahamas, and we're in the next chunk of the film, and we have this helicopter shot over this very languid music cue, which this whole transitional scene really doesn't have any impact. It's very languid. Again, to reference Moonraker, contrast this with, say, Bond's arrival in Rio and Moonraker with the really jaunty, warm, John Barry lush cue that really sells Rio as being exotic. Well, Nice is an exotic place, but here the cute pan over the poster that then reveals Felix Leiter. It's a cute shot that obviously is meant to suggest we're still looking at Nice, but of course it's actually a poster inside. Now, Bond arriving at an airport hadn't been seen in a while, and sort of integrating himself into another city, meeting the British intelligence agent. They don't really have a recognition code, and of course Nicole just walks up and is like, "Hey, I'm the British person here." But I do like this bit where Felix Leiter is introduced first as seeming to be an enemy agent. He's looking mysterious, he's got something in his hand, something's on his mind, and he hurls it at Bond, who catches it. This shows his reflexes are still up to snuff. And it gives Bond and Felix this sort of past history that they don't otherwise get to share. Of course, it's odd. I guess they carry around a hacky sack all the time. Anytime they're going to run into each other and throw it at them like a grenade. Of course, Felix Leiter here is played by Bernie Casey, and this is notable now for everyone going that this was the first time Felix Leiter had been played by a black actor. That was not the thing they had in mind when casting him. They just apparently his name got suggested, and everybody thought it was a good idea. I do like the rapport he establishes with Connery, and they have a nice relationship on screen. First established by that little bit with what looks like a hacky sack. But unfortunately, as in the official Eon films, Felix is such a secondary character that he's just in and out of the film. He has very little to do other than some of the legwork that Bond doesn't feel like doing at the time. Much like the problem with Felix Leiter in the original Thunderball film, he flies the helicopter around when they're looking for the Disco Volante. He hangs out at Pinder's. The Felix played by Rick Van Nutter in that film. So it's a problem they've always had with adapting the James Bond novels, that the Felix Leiter character always gets the short end of the stick. But we have Bond and Felix just basically only able to do low-key detective work and monitor Largo and follow up Bond's hunches that maybe this fellow has to be behind what's going on. Nicole takes the place of the Paula Kaplan character in the original Thunderball film, and once again is a major downturn from the wonderful character we have in that film that unfortunately doesn't have all that much to do and becomes the film's sacrificial lamb very quickly. But Martine Beswick had such a rapport with Connery and Terrence Young, the director, that she injects such life and vitality to that role, which did have more scenes that were cut out of the second act that was very heavily edited down by Peter Hunt. But here, Nicole in the film, all you know is she's French and she gets killed off. That's it. She's just kind of there, and you have to wonder why we even had to have that character in the film in the first place. I do like the little gag. This is Domino just going out to the spa for whatever reason and getting off the boat, really just to give Bond a chance to observe her and try and pump her for a little bit of information. But I like the little in-joke there of Bond apparently standing in front of that tree, and she looks at him and does a little sort of second glance back and then walks off, and then Bond comes around, which it's sort of similar, I guess, to the bit where Peter Franks goes to Tiffany Case's apartment in Amsterdam and Diamonds Are Forever, and Bond is introduced outside in that classic Connery moment of trying to peer like two lovers, and he's got his hands going on his sides, and he turns around, and of course you realize what he's been doing. Now, this sequence was shot in an actual English spa. The film did have a number of pickup shots and things done in England, and once production was complete, they actually did have to reopen and do some inserts and extra little bits here and there, and I think this is one of those. Apparently, this was shot at the very end of the production schedule. It is a nice moment for seeing Connery's machismo and his ability to just walk in a room and have all eyes go on him. And of course, seeing all these beautiful women in various states of undress staring with lustful eyes at Sean definitely helps sell Bond's sexual appeal. And we get this wonderful scene with a nice undercurrent of comedy where Bond is assuming the guise of being a masseuse and meeting Domino this way for the first time and basically trying to get information out of her. Of course, it doesn't reveal much other than she is sort of the kept woman and very much an innocent of sorts, and all Bond finds out is that Largo's essentially having a party that he's going to have to try and crash that night. If you look very closely on Bond's arm here, you can see what looks like Connery's classic Scotland Forever tattoo poking out on his arm. That's something that they always had to cover up with makeup back in the day. You can see the makeup patch in Thunderball in a number of spots. If you look very closely, sometimes they didn't do a very good job of covering it up or they rushed through it, but there are moments in Thunderball where you can really see it. But you see that dark patch. I believe that's his tattoo. Connery plays this scene majestically. He finds the right notes of humor and allowing Bond to show that he's enjoying this a little bit, but also that he is still being tender and understanding with the line readings of, say, for example, actually using the phrase "chez la vie," such is life. And that little winking, sort of winking without winking look that he gives Domino there, and she sort of smiles. So when it's revealed at the end of the scene that, Bond was obviously there under false pretenses, and she gets that confused look, and she's able to sort of just shrug it off and smile it away, she's essentially almost gotten felt up by this stranger. It was pleasurable on both sides. It was that nothing bad happened, and this is a scene that's very delicate to do, to find that balance between Bondisms and humor, and of course the gag gets played out to the full when Domino requests Bond to go lower, 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 and then Bond has to cover up his lapse by building on something that he picked up at Shrublands. Again, Connery does things with his physicality and his eyes, and his performance is full of all of these little moments. There's never There's never a single false moment. You can tell he's so fully committed to this character. And again, which is really surprising since the production was so chaotic and everyone was beyond frustrated and tearing their hair out. And Connery had deep interest and almost really became the de facto producer. In fact, I'd say probably on set every day. As Connery put it, between himself and David Tomlin, the first assistant director, they were literally the de facto producing team. And Connery has to carry the film on his back in every scene that he's in, and even the scenes he's not in for the most part. His presence is there, and he's really carrying the film on his back, and is able to do so effortlessly. So his professionalism is just off the charts. If you look there closely at the sign for Largo's Charity Ball, if you look very closely, it does mention this is the Casino Royale, so I have to think that must be an in-joke to reference not just the first Fleming original James Bond novel, Casino Royale, but the only other unofficial Bond film, Casino Royale. Connery able to toss off shouldn't have the fish with absolute aplomb. This is one of the best gags in the film, with the over burly protective security guard who happens to be carrying a Luger, and then Bond saying that he's going to leave him with this gyroscopic bomb in his cigarette case. And just the guy's look of terror and that he can't move is it seems like a terrible thing to do to a guy, but this guy obviously was there to, stop Bond or anyone else coming in, and that he gets his own just desserts is just wonderful. And you actually forget that he's there through the whole course of the casino sequence. So when we pick that up, it's a wonderful payoff due to that delay of time. And then Bond marches into this casino set, which is, again, using practical locations. Of course, the photography is good, except for the fact the lighting is a bit too much. We have a nice natural smoky haze, but it also seems a bit overdone too. Again, the rushed nature of the film comes up in the lighting, especially, which, for being shot by Douglas Slocum, it looks unbelievably flat in a lot of places. They did not have the time to even properly light most of the setups. It's okay here, but it's definitely showing itself. But I think it most appears in the interior, such as the airbase, and especially in the ending sequence in the Tears of Allah set they had to build. Of course, with a Bond film, it's classic to have a casino moment. I do always love the gag we saw just a minute ago with Bond dropping the guard's gun in the ice bucket. And now Bond is still following Domino around and observing her actions, which is going to lead to him reintroducing himself and giving us the film's proper James Bond introduction, but even that is poorly done. Unfortunately, the line reading is not very good, and it should have been retaken, but it never was. And then we get into the film's next moment of interjecting technology of the time into a traditional Bond setting. And this one I really find interesting. We get this nice little visual flourish with Domino opening the mirror doors, revealing Fatima Blush as well. And in this next room, the entire room is filled with arcade cabinets. Almost all seemingly Atari cabinets, but we see Gravatar and Centipede, and now Bond introduces himself by popping up in between one of the cabinets. And there we have Connery saying, "My name is Bond, James Bond," once again. But the framing and the actual line reading, I mean, Connery's on point, but it sounds like it needed a retake. It's not as polished as it should be. So for me, it's the weakest James Bond moment that around almost. We get a reprise of the harder soft massage gag, and then she orders a Bloody Mary. Hate to think what you call hard. Now we're reintroduced to Largo in the flesh. And of course, he's this seemingly polished businessman character, which is all a facade, which was a nice way to give something different to the traditional Bond character. And then Kirshner can't resist here showing Largo's true self, because he observes Bond and Domino behind the side panel artwork of a centipede cabinet with the giant, centipede monster. It's a very obvious visual metaphor, but it's well executed, and I'm an arcade geek, so I really love that moment. And I love this bit too, where Fatima and Largo are talking, and Largo is laughing, even though he knows that he's losing Domino to an underpaid British agent. Even though he's laughing about it, you can tell it's so on his nerves, and he just wants to go out there and probably kill the both of them with his bare hands. You can see that seething under the surface. I am fascinated with what Brandauer does with the Bond villain character and with this characterization of Largo. It is similar to what Adolfo Celli had to work with in the original Thunderball, because Bond and Largo have an interesting relationship with Domino being in the middle. Bond is continually thwarting Largo at every turn and frustrating not just his Spectre activities, but his business activities. He is one-upping him in social circles here at the casino, and he steals Domino away from Largo as well. So he has thwarted Largo on all fronts. And so Largo wants to not just destroy him for Spectre and for the mission, but for personal revenge on multiple fronts. But here, Largo contains all of this just barely under the surface, under this veneer of being affable, which makes his mania and his maniacal insanity all the more impactful. It's a different rendering of what Adolfo Celli did, where you could feel that anger simmering beneath the surface, but it felt very intrinsic. Here, this Largo, it seems like when he is going to explode, he's really going to explode. Unfortunately, we don't ever quite get that in the film's climax, but I just find it fascinating how he and Connery play off of each other with completely different acting styles. Brandauer was really the one person they went to after his performance in Mephisto, and Connery wanted him, everyone did, and he is just magnificent in the film. Again, as I said before, he and Connery are the best things about the film. And here in the domination sequence, we have, again, the film using technology in the traditional Bond realm, and it's also, for me, the single best scene in the film. Of course, it's the classic Bond villain confrontation in a public setting, where there are many things going on beneath the surface, and we have Bond at first appearing to be bested by the villain, but using that to hoist the villain on his own petard and humiliate him publicly. But what I love about this is not that it's a video game, but the fact that it builds intensity well. We have Bond fail not once, but twice, and getting Largo to be completely, supremely overconfident. But I love the fact that this is a game that Largo designed himself. And I love the added grace notes that he doesn't inform Bond of all the rules. He is always stacking the game in his favor. So this is very much like, say, for example, Sir Hugo Drax cheating at cards in the Moonraker novel, how he and Bond first meet. Or, of course, more famously, Goldfinger cheating at golf. It's a classic Bond villain moment, and it's the classic Bond versus villain initial confrontation in public. But many new little inventions here, and the performances are fantastic. And of course, all of this in the domination game had to be created in post-production. So you have the two actors sitting there just reacting with the handles and nothing in front of them. And their performances are fantastic. So it's even more impressive that all they had was a little light reflecting on their face in the close-ups. That's it. So you can imagine Sean getting in there and being like, I'm supposed to pull these joysticks around. What the bloody hell is this? But they sell it so unbelievably well. And this is the one point where I think everything in the film comes together perfectly. Then we get the cutaways to Fatima moving her way through the crowd. We get the cutaways to Domino. We get the intensity building. The shots become closer in the close-ups until we get to this final bit. And again, Bond has failed multiple times, and the pain level increases as they go along, so we can get the sense of the intensity building. Also, the sound design in terms of the sound effects design is really impeccable here, with the sound effects of the joysticks, the sound effects of the laser blasts, the increasing churning of the game machine building up tension, the bombs having noises, and even the little shields having noises. You can almost feel the sweat on their palms as they're gripping these joysticks that are building the electric shock. And the intensity is most built by the fact that Bond appears to be out of his element completely. He's already failed multiple times, and he's still trying, and he's still failing. So that's giving us that danger sense for the first time in a long while in this film. And now finally Bond is going to actually be thrown to the floor, which is something we had never really seen at this point. Nice little Legrand cue. It may be a little bit much, but it's fine because it is breaking that really intensive build-up. And at this point, Bond has actually lost. It seems that they're going to stop the game because he's been thrown to the floor. Largo tries to put his hand on him, and you see Bond get up before Largo can lay a hand on him, and then Largo just takes it away. And of course, Bond has lost a hefty sum by this point. Bond lets Largo think that he's won for a brief moment, and then hits him with the final challenge. One more game for the rest of the world. You can see it playing out on Largo's face. You can see him relishing the moment, the little pause, and you can see the charm suddenly come on in Sean's eyes that he's ready to throw it back at him finally. And by the end of this sequence, you've realized that Bond has completely played Largo throughout this entire scene. And Largo realizes it as well, which only furthers his own personal humiliation. Now, the notion of Bond and a villain playing a computer game or a video game of sorts, most people would think this is the one real time it happened. Well, no, actually, to make another John Gardner reference, after this, in Gardner's fourth novel, Roll of Honor, we do have Bond and the villain, J. Autumn Holy, playing the villain's own computer game because he is a computer programmer as part of his dastardly plan. And we, again, have Bond using the villain's own designed game against him. He manages to win by... it's a historical game based on military battles. He's able to win by not following the plot of history and using his own instincts. Exactly the same as what happens here. So I think it's interesting. I don't know if Gardner was specifically influenced by this, but it's interesting to note that where I felt the film always should have taken some of Gardner's ideas, or here we have a moment that seems to have influenced maybe a later Gardner novel. I love the added touch that Brandauer adds of blowing off one hand slightly. Kirshner has said that he was, a highly improvisational actor who liked to go for intensive takes, and that Kirshner found it very difficult to sort of rein him in where he felt it was necessary. But I do think that questionable factor, that slight quality of the unknown, is what gives that unsettling feeling to every time that this Max Largo is on screen. It makes him so different from Emilio Largo. And the scene gets finished with Domino being like, oh, he's never gone this far before. And then I love how Bond simply ends this with saying, he's certifiable. So we have done that scene. And like all classic Bond and villain confrontations, it fully reveals to Bond that he's on the right track because this guy is literally nuts. So now we cut into the tango sequence, which Bond has foregone his winnings for to dance with Domino. Now, if you look closely, of course, most of this is shot in closer scenes to get away from the fact that Connery himself was not a very good dancer. Basinger had been a dancer before, which is why I think they made her character a dancer. But it was very clear that Sean was not going to be very comfortable or very good at this sequence. So they very quickly move into close shots and close-ups. But the real problem with this is the fact that they use this to have Bond reveal that her brother's been murdered, and it's just done in such a way that, especially her reaction, that sharp intake of breath, it's just absolutely hilarious in a bad way. Apparently this was shot for comedy and people do laugh, but it's a really bad kind of laugh. It's not effective at all, and it really undercuts the drama of this. And again, it doesn't help that Basinger's so inexperienced by this point that we once again get that deer in the headlights sort of look. It's just, it's not, it gets a bad laugh. Whereas in the original Thunderball film, Bond reveals this to Domino when they're on the beach after making love underwater, and Bond hides his emotions by putting on sunglasses. It's a very surprisingly emotional scene, a very human scene between Bond and Domino. We don't have any of that here. We do have Largo looking over on the balcony and being very ominous, which is great. And then we have this moment, which is where Fatima completely goes into cartoon territory by relishing she's going to get another chance to kill Bond, so much so that they did the improvised bit there where she comes down the stairs, throws her hat off, and does her hair and everything, which it's fitting in this characterization that they've come up with, but it just, every time she winds up doing something like that, it makes her character feel cartoonish, and she loses the quality of danger that the Fiona Volpe character had. And obviously the Fatima character being sort of over the top seems very much the influence on the Xenia Onatopp character in GoldenEye. Nice little bit of duplicity going on. Obviously, Largo's been lying to Domino the whole time that Jack has been delayed many times over. Now we get the delayed payoff with the guard who's been holding the thing the whole time. Bond pops in. Thanks very much. And you can tell by the fact his position's a little different and the frames on the wall have been knocked that apparently he's accidentally shuffled a bit in terror. And of course, Bond reveals it's just his cigarette case. Bond arrives back. A nice little ponderous moment. I like the bit where he pauses over the fruit bowl. It's almost like he's going to pick up a grape, which is, of course, what Bond famously does in Count Lippe's room in Thunderball. And you see Sean pause and decide not to get the grape instead. This little music cue that Legrand comes up with, it's the same melody he has in the little cue when Bond's Bentley pulls up outside of Shrublands. That's my favorite moment in the entire score. That little melody, I think that perfectly suggests Bond's age and his instincts and his feeling displaced from the rest of the world. I wish so badly that was the main theme of the score, because that is the best thing in the entire score. Unfortunately, we only get it in these little tiny parts, and weirdly we get it there, and all of a sudden we turn into the suspense sequence because we see a glimpse of what maybe looks like Fatima Blush. Bond feels this ominous note. The windows are open. The curtains are blowing in the breeze, and we see him dump the fruit amusingly on the little forked spike of the little statuette. Now, this, of course, is where they shot many of the famous promo stills that were used for the ad campaign of Connery with pistol pointed at the camera. Then we cut to this rather unfortunate jump cut of Nicole's body in this sort of odd waterbed with a very blaring Legrand cue. We cut back to the heels, which are Fatima Blush's visual trademark of seeing her stiletto heels running around. And then we're into this jazzy cue that's supposed to be for the action sequence. This is the most active the score ever gets, and I know a lot of people complain about the score, and I definitely have my own issues with it. But, for a bit of action music, it's an interesting choice to go for this jazzy vibe. It's not bad. It works. And it's the most energetic the score ever gets. So it's a shame that it just suddenly stops and cuts out as soon as the motorcycle takes off. Now, again, a lot of this sequence wound up having to be improvised because when the motorcycle arrived, Kirshner recounted in the audio commentary, it was supposed to have these wings that came out. And when they do the jump on the docks later on, the production company never built the wings on it, and no one told Kirshner. One of many things where no one communicated stuff that was decided on. So they went to shoot this sequence, and the motorcycle didn't have the wings or the extra gadgets it was supposed to have. So that meant that this whole sequence was definitely dialed down. It is nice to see real location footage and actually a man doing this on a real motorcycle in the pre-CGI era. It is so refreshing to see any action sequence from these days, even one like this where it's very simple, and because it's real people doing the real stunts themselves, and we're so inundated with just not having anything physically there on screen outside of people or items in front of a green screen that even this bit here has a nice ominous feel to it, with Bond being cornered in this trap set in this tunnel. And I like that it allows Bond to use his wits and end on a note of humor. They get him on the trailer truck by actually firing at him and forcing him on, pushing him on with the car. But of course, why they didn't just force Bond to get off the motorcycle is one of the classic stupid villain blunders. But we get this really wonderful moment where they start to raise the gate, and it becomes a natural ramp, which then Bond, of course, immediately escapes out of. And the great part about this chase is it starts as Bond chasing villain, but becomes villain chasing Bond. So it's a nice reversal, and with a nice bit of humor halfway through. She gets an extra dose of humor here by Bond lying in wait and coming out to stop them. Now, if you look closely at the car there, when it's in close-up at the car grill, if you look closely, there's black tape on what seems to be the logo of the car. So I've always felt like maybe they didn't have the rights to show the logo of the make of the car or something. Or it was just a mistake that was accidentally left in for some reason. Well, that's pretty much the only gadget we see with this motorcycle. The reinforced bumpers that come out on the front and back, and the rocket motor that allows for the large jumps. Again, originally the motorcycle was going to have these wings that came out and actually made it fly a bit, which probably was going to be a bit ridiculous. It's the jumps are nice, that being the main one there, but that's really all the bike does. We get another little blast of this jazzy action cue, and then unfortunately, Bond rides into this little abandoned shack warehouse area and immediately gets knocked off of said bike, and action scene is over. It does make Bond look a bit foolish that he rides in here, Fatima somehow immediately disappeared, and then he just immediately gets knocked off by this beam that comes out. Now, this is supposed to be the element at which Bond is at his lowest. He's, of course, on the ground, not on his knees as he was in For Much With Love, of course, but he is staring into a gun wielded by someone who is ready and willing to eliminate him and just absolutely dying to do so. So this is giving us a For Much With Love type moment where Bond is staring into his own death. He is disarmed and must rely only on his wits to escape the situation, and by trying to manipulate the psychology of his adversary, just as he does with Red Grant in the Orient Express train car. So, brilliant setup, brilliant idea. If this is how they wanted to get rid of Fatima, no problem. I'm totally on board with this. But it's got this comedic element to it. Here, Fatima seems completely unhinged. And then we get this bit where it's all sexually motivated. I guess where you get the first one. And Bond is able to somehow manipulate Fatima into requiring a confession that she was essentially the greatest sexual encounter of James Bond's life, which is an idea that I find absolutely hilarious. Just the idea that Bond would have to do this, and of course that he would even write a memoir and name all his sexual conquests. It's an amusing idea, and Sean plays it well, and Barbara Carrera plays the scene well, but it's this undercurrent of humor that takes out most of the tensions. You forget the fact that Bond is really up against it here. So it makes the scene a scene you play for comedy instead of a real tension-filled scene that Bond is only able to barely escape by the untested Q pen gadget. The idea being here that maybe you've forgotten about the pen by this point, or as soon as you see the pen come out, it's like, oh, how's this going to work? But you have to remember that it's been untested. I like the way that she does the line reading 007, and then she keeps bringing the gun up. The idea that not allowed to give service endorsements. And I must admit, as a diehard fan, I've always wondered if Bond's line about there was this girl in Philadelphia, it makes me think that maybe he's referring to Jill Masterson in the Goldfinger novel. The inspired part of this scene, though, is the pen that doesn't work. That Bond fires it, we hear the noise of it being cocked first, and then this tiny little wound happens. Nothing else. It's like the thing didn't work. Fatima laughs. She finds it ridiculous that Bond has done this, and this tiny little wound Bond pauses, and there's that pausing of time. And only then, when Fatima starts to laugh and goes to shoot Bond, do we get the cutaway to the flame coming out, and then the explosion, which is super over dramatic. Beautifully done. And then we get the cutaway to the only thing left of Fatima is her burning stiletto heels. Again, that is the Wizard of Oz reference to the Wicked Witch. All that's left of her is her shoes. It's a bit much, but it's okay, I suppose. And then we get this bizarre little bit where Felix has been sitting there the whole time watching to see how Bond would get out of it, just in a bemused sort of fashion. And then they have to get out of there before the police come in. And then we have the extra little comic bit where they're just jogging and cycling along in their underclothes to get through the French police. Again, there is this nice sort of camaraderie between the two, but it's only inherent stuff. It's not, they don't really get to do much of anything. But the idea of Felix just standing there while Fatima's doing all this and about to just totally off Bond and just sitting there waiting, I'm just going to wait and see how James gets out of this one. This is pretty tight. And then bemused when Bond manages to do so. Of course, the flying saucer has to have an underwater hatch, just like the one in the Disco Volante and Thunderball. But here it's on the side, and it's just very nondescript. Almost looks like a giant portal almost underwater. And then it just opens, and Bond gets sort of swept in, and then poor Felix gets shut out, and then basically disappears for the next chunk of the movie. And so I still wonder to this day, I suppose it's intentional. Like Largo was monitoring their progress, and we had the bit earlier where Bond was supposed to visit Largo. Obviously, he was supposed to be eliminated by Fatima first. But I've always wondered: is Largo literally expecting Bond, and he sucks him in, and then is like, "Oh, you showed up. Now we're going to take off." Was he planning for Bond to show up like this and just come in almost naked except for his swimming trunks by stripping off his wetsuit? Or, there you very clearly see his forearm tattoo there. There are moments in this film where they just don't even bother covering it, which I find absolutely hilarious. So I have to assume, again, that Largo was apparently waiting for Bond to come close to the boat so then he could suck him aboard the flying saucer and take off for Palmyra, which is now located for some reason in North Africa, because of course we're no longer in the Bahamas as the original Palmyra was. Again, there's little for Domino to do than come around and look very concerned, and unfortunately have that deer in the headlights sort of look again. I've always felt that I really wish that it was the Kim Basinger of 1989 that was in this film, the Kim Basinger who played Vicky Vale in Batman, who had much more experience under her belt and was much better able to carry this sort of female character inside of a male hero film sort of role with more gravitas and more distinction, because she is much better. Of course, that character has much more to do than just stand around and be the damsel in distress and look concerned. But I do wish she had had more experience, or they had cast somebody else with more experience, because I do think it is a detriment to the film that she's so much of a damsel in distress. And then we have poor Felix here, left out once again. I love that he's just, all he can do is just throw his face mask in the water and watch the ship take off. It's just like, ah. And again, he disappears for the next chunk of the film. Now, this scene takes the place of a deleted scene from the original Thunderball film where Largo gives Bond a tour of the Disco Volante, which we can only see in stills. We get a little bit of this in the Thunderball novel, but this we get Largo taking Bond through his ship and showing him the command center. Bond sort of trying to puncture Largo's ego at every turn, and Largo being able to just laugh it off just barely, but we can tell under the surface that Bond is still getting to him. And I like that Largo leaves Bond in his central complex lair and goes on to do his daily work activities until lunch. knowing that Bond can't possibly get any information out of what he sees because it's all tied up in his business ventures. But Bond, being the intelligence man that he is, he's able to see the small little last screen through the door. He's looking at anything he possibly can without being noticed, and he's able to see the thing about the Tears of Allah. And he remembers that and is able to recall it later and start to tie it into new elements that he discovers, and eventually the pendant Domino wears. Of course, Domino's dancing close, or shall we say, rather revealing of her physique in these sequences. Of course, they just happen to have something in Sean's size support because Bond arrived without clothes. I wish I knew the name of this music piece that plays every time they're in Domino's dancing practice room because it gets stuck in your head. Of course, Bond using it to cover up the listing devices that he's sure are there because he knows Largo would be watching in a voyeuristic way. This is a brilliant scene. Kirshner admitted it was very difficult to try and get across what he was doing here and that Largo would be observing what's going on, but I think it's set up perfectly well. Bond is pumping Domino for information here. He's doing this and full well knowing that Largo would be observing them the entire time. He turns up the music to cover up the sound of their voices, but Largo's able to watch them and realize that in his mind Domino is probably betraying him and being manipulated by Bond. So you have that element of personal betrayal, and then Bond will eventually come on to her, ostensibly in Largo's eyes, to really raise his blood up to the point that he's going to charge in there maniacally and have finally snapped. I love Bond's psychological manipulation of Largo at this point, his knowing that he would be watching her, and that he is able to do all this while romancing Domino at the same time. And you get that provoke a reaction line. She asks, "What's the other reason?" "Because I always wanted to." And then not only does he kiss her passionately, his eye comes open and then he turns to face her in the glass where he knows Largo must be watching. And we're not let in on the entirety of Bond's plan because now we get the cutaway, the nice build of suspense. Largo bursts through, they're already gone, and we see Domino activate the fire alarm, which ostensibly is covered up by the loud music in the suite. Bond knows that he's counting on the fact that Largo is too angry at this point to be thinking clearly. And so now this gives Bond the opportunity to break in and transmit a message to MI6 about his location. And he's going to have to do this by trying to break into Largo's command chamber. And this also gives him the opportunity to physically observe Largo deteriorating inside and to turn the tables not just in the relationship with Domino and the relationship between Bond and villain in terms of plot, that Bond's able to transmit a message via a radio here, but that he's able to see the fruits of his handiwork. And Largo snaps to the point that he grabs his fire axe and he starts smashing the mirrors. And Bond takes the time after transmitting the message to turn the console over, and that slight smile crawls over his face. And then when Largo breaks the stereo, here's the fire alarm. You see it play out on his face, and they're staring at each other without staring at each other. And they let that moment hold for just long enough to really to sell that moment. It's a great pair of matching close-ups. And of course, they're staring Largo at a mirror, a one-way mirror, and Bond staring a hole right through him, each knowing exactly where the other is, even though they couldn't obviously prove it. But that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Largo knows Bond has done this. There is no question of it. This brings us to Palmyra, where Largo will completely dispense with the pleasantries and immediately lead Bond away to his prison cell. But first, he doesn't drop the facade because it's part of his being. It's not something he's playing at. It's just part of his insanity, which I find so interesting. And his costuming, he's got the sweater tied over nonchalantly, and his shirt is unbuttoned, and he's got this fancy estate loaded with these art treasures that he obviously cares nothing about. There's so many layers here. This is a fascinating character and performance that. It's just such a shame that we don't get more. And then this probing close-up he has where he's staring at Bond. Bond stares back at him. We see the armed guard in the background. Largo walks closer. He grabs Domino, starts caressing her face, and then says, "The game is over, Bond." Almost as an afterthought. It's a really striking moment. And this is where he grabs his most priceless treasure, gives it to Domino, and then very creepily sort of leers over her and then starts talking of marriage. He's enjoying tormenting her at this point. He knows that she has betrayed him and that she is obviously aware of how he had her brother murdered and is up to no good and absolutely insane. But he toys with her and he enjoys this. He's enraged that she has betrayed him, but it's not enough for him to simply eliminate her. No, he's going to mess with her a bit. And interestingly, he says he forgives her at first, which is a really interesting thing for a Bond villain to do. And then he plants this very forced, creepy kiss on her, where he physically grabs her, and you see the spittle come away when he pulls away. And then he grabs the piece of jade and smashes it. And only then does she realize that he's crazy. And he takes it. He says, "Yeah, maybe." And then he smiles, which is so unsettling. Completed with a kiss of the hand and then this very creepy whistle. Again, this man is completely, as Bond says earlier, certifiable. And he does all of this and conveys all of this without ever having to raise his voice or go all shouty or kill a bunch of people, obviously, to show that he's psychotic or something. He does it by unsettling not only the audience, but the characters in every moment. I think this is probably what Brandauer was going after, and I'm sure some of his improvisations found their way into the film. As I said before, I think his very non-typical approach to the role of the Bond villain and trying to improvise where he thought necessary adds this unsettling quality. It's very similar, I think, to what we see with Christopher Walken's performance as Zorin in A View to a Kill. He does it differently, but it's sort of a similar wavelength, and I think you can draw a distinct parallel between Brandauer's Largo here and Christopher Walken's Zorin in A View to a Kill. And then I especially love this exchange here where Bond is left tied up with these vultures in this very almost classical adventure-style rooftop dungeon in this castle. But Bond still asks where the bombs are, and Largo is bemused. You know, he's like, you're still on the case, even though you have no chance of escaping. Well, you know, I'll tell you where one of the bombs is, simply because I admire your spirit, and you're never going to get out of here. But tellingly, he does decide to keep the second bomb a secret about the tears of Valhalla and everything. And then he at least admits, you know, you were a very good secret agent. And all Bond can do is smile. I have to admit, this setting and the costuming and stuff, it does always remind me a little bit of what we'd see in the Afghanistan sequences in The Living Daylights 4 years down the road. And I like the idea that it's not enough for Largo to kill Domino. He's going to essentially sell her into a sort of slavery, and she's going to probably face a fate worse than death in many different ways. And then they bring in this whole contingent of people to bid for this exotic blonde figure. I also like the moment where Largo pauses when Bond is able to use the laser watch to break through the chains. There's a slight noise, and Bond has to duck back. It's an extra little note of drama. And then Largo nonchalantly walks off. Of course, it's interesting to note this is the first time any sort of James Bond film used a laser watch, which would basically become a sort of standard idea in the James Bond lexicon. We see it, of course, in the official films for the first time in GoldenEye. Again, I think of the Living Daylights when the line Bond tosses off the car when they break out of the airbase, and Cameron Shaw tells them, "Told them you know Russian. They won't kill you now." Kara says, "Not now. How about later?" And Bond tosses off, "Don't worry, they'll save it for the harem." So that, of course, always makes me think of this scene where it's like that's probably where Domino's final fate is to be if she is indeed purchased. A bizarre note, Largo climbs on here and he gets on the boat, and just sitting right there out in the open is the is the nuclear warhead. It's just sitting there, and he has to tell them, "Oh, cover it up." It's like, why is it just on a boat? I suppose it was just kept in a vault somewhere in Palmyra, but it's just bizarre. It's just sitting there on a speedboat. Of course, Bond using his wits to overcome a guard. This is seemingly right out of Goldfinger, where Bond is able to, as the soundtrack cue always indicates, the cue teasing the Korean, meaning that he's able to lure a guard in and overcome them. This being a cute classical sort of gag where Bond hangs out the window and is able to pull the guard out to his death. One thing that always sells Connery's Bond is one punch and everyone goes down. You never feel a Connery punch is not the full 100% takedown punch that it always is. It's always with conviction, the Connery punch. I like Bond using a little bit of disguise to try and worm his way in to the scenario going on, just with a quick bit of using a headscarf and using an unlit cigarette, which again makes me think of the Living Daylights, and the unlit cigarette makes me think of Tomorrow Never Dies even, and the pre-title sequence. Now Bond and Domino try to escape on horseback, and we get a little blast of a sort of jazzy music cue, and then we go into this Legrand cue that has this sort of rising feel as they go off to the top of the castle, and it seems a bizarre way to go because there's apparently nowhere to run. And interesting, they stay on horseback for the entirety of this. Of course, seeing the hero and love interest on a horse seems ripped right out of classical adventure storytelling, which it's such a beautiful image that I don't have a problem with it. But the issue is they get to the top of the castle and this music is still building in a sort of strange way. And you have to wonder, well, where are they going to go with this? How are they going to get out of this? And they reach the end of the parapet and there's nothing below but water and a long drop. And then they do the jump with the horse over, which is just... It's a strange way to get out of this. It caused censorship problems in the UK and other territories because people were worried about the horse. Of course, this was all staged, so they only jumped a very short distance. And then there's a very obvious process shot, and then we get this process shot of the supposed horse that figures falling. And then the pickup here when they go in the water. So it was, obviously done in several parts. None of them are very convincing at all, especially when they go to that close-up of Bond and Domino. And then you go in the water, and all of a sudden their clothes are gone. Like, that is just Oh, that is unbelievable. I don't know. It's just, I mean, Bond still has his pants on, but I mean, his shirt is gone. I just have never understood that. I always felt it was a continuity problem. I don't know why Bond's clothes would suddenly be missing. Of course, the gag is here that Bond's message got through, and a British submarine is there to just lay siege to, sorry, I should say an American submarine, to lay siege to the would-be attackers with rifles. Seems like a bit of overkill, of course. Felix arrives back in the picture as he's arrived on the American sub. It should be noted that this film had no military participation, so every time you see something, it's faked, and then this shot is actually stolen. Ironically, this shot is lifted directly from Ice Station Zebra, so that film pops up again in this commentary track. That is a direct reuse of footage from Ice Station Zebra from 1968. Here we have the beautiful Legrand cue crop up again. Again, I love this little piece of music. I do like that Domino and Bond are having a little bit of fun, although a shower this large and seemingly luxurious on a submarine, I don't quite believe, but I like that Bond has a little bit of humor here, and we get the now sort of classic moment where Bond is going to have to go after the villain, and the girl is like, "No, I don't want you to. I don't want to lose you," and it's very cringy the way that it's written here because it's so cliched and dull. This would become completely psychoanalyzed in GoldenEye with the beach scene where Natalia walks up to Bond, who's steeling himself up to go after 006 in the climax of that film. That's basically doing a complete psychoanalysis of this type of scene. But it is confirming the Bond-Domino relationship, that she does care for Bond, that she is committed in this relationship, and also trying to get revenge on Largo. I must admit, I do love this gag here that M comes back into the picture only over intercom and is as foppish as ever, and Edward Fox is just going on and on and on. And then if Bond comes through alive, "I'd like to offer you lunch at my club," which seems like a new, fresh version of hell for this James Bond. The idea of eating lunch with the new M at his club seems like a nightmare. Of course, the idea of being with M at his club makes you think of the club Blades and the sequence in Moonraker where Bond and M go to Blades and encounter Sir Hugo Drax. So it may be a nice little unintentional nod to Fleming again as well. And a little bit of humor where Bond basically gets back to the more important business in hand and cuts him off. Another little bit of using technology by having the flying saucer appear only on monitor screen and not seeing an establishing shot outside. Now we're having to do exposition here, but we have Bond and Felix and company actually having to talk out the problem and think for themselves. Bond now reflecting on seeing the tears of Allah on the screen and thinking about what suddenly remembering the pendant that Domino told him about. Seeing the map image looked familiar, and now he's able to realize that the pendant is a map, and the diamond marks a spot, a point of entry to the oil fields. Now he realizes that Spectre's plan must be to jeopardize the oil fields and their detonation of the second nuclear warhead there would be the most dastardly location they could do to affect the current status of the world economically. Which is a great idea. It's unfortunate that it's just kind of there and the film doesn't do very much with that idea because, again, as an idea and exploding a nuclear warhead underground, not only what that would do to the world economically, but what it would do to the natural ecosystem of that portion of the world. It would destroy it, and of course, as Renard would say later in The World's Not Enough, the bright, oil-driven, starry-eyed future of the West would be no more. At least this Largo does take command of things himself and leads his crew underwater, but None of this has any of the impact or drama or buildup that we get in Thunderball. It's just kind of, unfortunately, run of the mill, particularly with the Legrand queue that's laid over it. Interestingly, they do have sort of propulsion sleds there, but that's another thing that Kirshner admitted in his audio commentary was supposed to be much more impressive, and then they got there and it didn't really work. So then they had to quickly redesign this sled thing that you see here, and it actually work and move around underwater because they went to shoot it and the thing didn't work. Now this is where we get to the where it really shows in the final third of the film that we don't have all the wittiness that we have in the first half. This is where I think that Clement and LaFontaine really didn't get to finesse everything. I think this is where it really shows that the production was really struggling to meet that release date and starting to really rush. We do get one nice gag here where Bond admits he knows about the experimental rocket observation transports that he and Felix will use by reading a Russian stolen translation of the American manual. But that's a joke from The Spy Who Loved Me, because that's how Triple X knows about how to use the limpet mine and smoke canister on Wet Nelly. Now, this is a really terribly unimpressive optical effects shot. It's really not good. I mean, the idea is cool enough, and this is essentially the film doing a version of the Bell Textron rocket belt from the opening pre-title sequence of Thunderball, which seems a direct steal, and again, something else I think that Eon could have raised hell over, but I guess maybe at this point decided not to. The close-up shots are fine of Connery and Bernie Casey on this platform thing, but every time we have the long shots, it's really unconvincing. And as you see here, just the idea that they're going around on these little rocket things. Again, it's basically a platform version of the rocket belt from Thunderball. It's the same exact thing. And they could have just gotten on a small launch like how they got on the submarine, because they're going to dive back in the water anyway. So why do we have to have that? It's just something cool and something like, ooh, they're using a rocket. Well, again, that's sort of just ripping off something from Thunderball, and they get right back in the water. So there was no real purpose to that whole sequence. So interestingly, they're able to just immediately find the secret cave area that Largo and company just went through. We don't have any of the Bond infiltrating Largo's crew that we got in the original Thunderball, where Bond had to really work at it because he had to discover where the bombs were hidden in the secret underwater cavern. And then he's captured and has to be rescued by Felix to then join the final underwater battle. He has to find out their target location. He's only able to relay that once Felix picks him up, and then it's a race against time. We don't have any of that tension here. While obviously they can't do what Thunderball did, they could do what the novel did, which did have some tension build up and did build to a final underwater battle with Bond leading the crew from the submarine that they're on, which is why he and Felix are on a sub, as they are in the novel. So that part's fine, but we don't have any sort of tension. We don't have any ticking clock. We don't have any mystery because we've already figured out what they're trying to do. And now it's just Bond and Felix infiltrating this sort of final villain lair, even though it's not a lair. This is the one big set of the film. And as I alluded to before, even Kirshner feels this was not very well shot due to how rushed they were. However, there's one little moment that's really impressive right here. As Bond and Felix run in the tunnel, and they've got these flashlights. This shot here, this handheld shot, this reverse tracking from a low angle, really impressive because it's the only bit in this sequence that has any sort of tension to it. And it just shows how flat this is. Again, you can see how brightly lit this set is. And keep in mind, this is the cinematographer who just worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark and shot The Well of the Souls, for example. Kirshner did surmise that perhaps maybe this was the point where Slocum did have to have some eye operations done. He did have a detached retina. And that there were some points in the film's shoot where some other people had to step in and replace him for a while he was out. And he thought maybe this was one of those points where there was. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've always felt this is definitely one of those times where you see a set and it looks painfully like a set. The construction is fine, and I like the usage of figures to suggest it being in a ancient temple that's fallen underground. But again, due to the lighting and everything being super bright, it has the appearance of being a set. The only tension here is the fact that Felix and Bond are obviously outnumbered, and these guys have a nuclear warhead, so they have to figure out ways of dispatching all of these guys, and of course not letting them actually activate said warhead. Once again, Largo calling over to Kovac and actually talking to Blofeld again over video monitor. And if you look closely, I like that they're just towing this nuclear warhead. They just rigged up a rope and pulley, and that's their plan to get it into place. They're just going to have some guys pull it over a rope and like over a, I guess, maybe a 20-foot drop or something. That just seems very precarious to do with a nuclear warhead. And then these guys are rappelling off of this obviously crumbling statue head that Bond is going to use to topple over. Again, if you look at this, it just seems like a really bad idea. Like, why would these guys do this with a nuclear warhead? I don't know. I really like this moment, though, where Kovac walks in, they have this pause, then Largo walks in. This is apparently an improvised line. Largo spits out the water and says, "Sweet like money." Kirschner said that was an improvised bit that he kept in because it was so good. So I feel the Largo role is filled with a lot of little flourishes like that obviously were not there on whatever script pages they were handed that day. Now Bond has announced his presence, maybe taken out a few of the opposition. Felix uses this at that point to start laying down cover fire. If you look there at the guy who shoots out the Uzi from Bond's hand and then gets hit by Felix, that is actually Andy Bradford, who appeared in For Your Eyes Only as the poor guard who gets hit with Melina's crossbow bolt, and also in Octopussy as the ill-fated 009 in the opening of the film. Nice little bit of tension as Felix is being closed in on. He's run out of ammo. But as soon as they get close, all of a sudden we get the assault team from the submarine. So the tension is gone. And rather amusingly, they're all in wetsuits with black headpieces. So it just looks kind of silly. We do start to get some tension here as the Spectre guys start to have some panic on their face. Largo is running around. He actually looks like he's panicked a bit. Kovac puts the controlling device on really quick, and they have to activate the bomb, and Largo has to run it out of there and try and get it into place because I guess ostensibly the plan is now, we're just going to blow it now anyway because we've been discovered, and why not? If you listen very closely, there are a number of classic sound effects here, even some of the classic machine gun sound effects that we hear in the early Bond films, especially Goldfinger, which I think is entirely due to Norman Wanstall coming back and working on the sound effects, which, again, the sound effects in this film are great. It's just the actual mix is not very impressive for being a title in the Dolby Stereo era. Of course, Bond dives down dramatically to chase after Largo, who, of course, has one more ace up his sleeve by blowing a charge in the exit he just left. So then Bond's way to him is cut off. Very Blofeld-like, as we see Blofeld destroy the volcano layer at the end of You Only Live Twice, for example. And then it looks like the whole place is going to start to come down. again, it becomes very obvious there's not a whole lot of anything special about this. It now becomes just a matter of, okay, now we have to get to the end of the climax. There's no additional elements. Now all Bond has to do is he has to stop Largo. Now, if you look at this closely, of course, Bond is sort of caught in an underground area and has to get a helicopter to get out to go after the villain. So you could say this is very similar to Bond getting captured in the original film, being left to die and being able to escape and be picked up by helicopter to be taken to where Largo is at the final battle. Well, here we have a Navy helicopter instead of a Coast Guard helicopter, and Bond is lowered in with new apparatus, so it's another little nod you could make to the original Thunderball if you wanted to make a connection there. And then Bond is going to dive down this well area and try to catch up or get in slightly ahead of Largo, who's using these ancient underground water tunnels and caverns that they've discovered. I do like that this is rather ominous due to how dark it is and this location. Of course, everybody likes to complain that underwater sequences are slow and they don't have any drama, and that was the big problem in Thunderball. I understand where they're coming from with that. However, in Thunderball, it uses the atmosphere of being underwater as sort of a not quite as if it was a horror film, but it has that uncanny quality to it that for me makes it the definitive water film. But here, this whole climax is so rote and run of the mill, and again, it's very dark. We do have at least good close-ups showing the actors' faces, so it's not all done by doubles, which helps to sell any underwater sequence. They do run into the same problems Thunderball did, that there's not much you can do underwater than rip off face masks, which Bond just does to Largo there. Then you have a knife, and you can cut the other person's air hose, and that's about it. Or use spear guns. And, of course, this climax will do all three. Of course, the sled is going on by itself with the nuclear warhead still strapped to it. This probably would be a little bit more effective, too, without this particular music cue on it, which just helps to cut most of the tension with this. It's not jaunty, but it has a sort of jauntiness to it, which just, again, this is just so anticlimactic, and this should be a real, just emotionally charged battle because Largo absolutely hates Bond and is so maniacally devoted to destroying him, in addition to carrying out his mission for Spectre. And you just don't get that. You get to Bond build it to a point where he's able to trap Largo with his own sled and then work on trying to deactivate the bomb. Interestingly, of course, Bond defeats the technology by shoving his diving knife in the propeller. So it's, again, this notion of old tricks defeating technology. Again, something we see in GoldenEye. Again, there's a lot of GoldenEye allusions for some reason, but Bond is stopping the antenna movement by shoving a pole in the mechanism. And, of course, here, Bond doesn't take the time to make sure Largo is dead. And we do have the classic moment where Bond is going to die and is saved by Domino killing Bond and being a surprise reveal. This is a bit more like how it goes in the novel when we see Domino's blonde hair giving away that it is Domino who rescues Bond. Of course, as she would, being unaccustomed to killing someone, she starts to freak out a bit, and Bond, recognizing this, goes over to her to comfort her and take her away from the sight of the man she just murdered. I do like we get the shot of Largo's dead body with the arms frozen in death with the spear sticking out. But it doesn't have the buildup or the intensity of the same thing in Thunderball. And we don't get that moment where we feel that Largo is relishing the moment where he's about to shoot Bond. And we don't feel Domino's revenge being accomplished for the killing of her brother. It's just one note here, and it's extremely anticlimactic. And then we go into this bit where Herb Alpert performs on the soundtrack, and I do love this ending music cue with Herb Alpert. It sounds wonderful. It's very relaxed. It's a great way to exit the film. We see Bond enjoying his sort of imposed retirement, because the idea is that he's going to leave the service at this point with "Los days are over." But there's time for one last bit of comedic action. This was also apparently improvised as well. The idea was developed to have a final tag ending, almost to reference how most Bond films have a tag ending with the secondary henchman character that the audience has hopefully forgotten about by that point. And Bond has one last moment of danger to overcome to then enjoy the final clinch with the leading lady of the film and fade out into the end titles. So we get a sort of matching bit of action to the opening with Bond sneaking around in the jungle, and now, of course, it's Nigel Smallfaucet. And the idea being that M's afraid that the free world is at stake if you don't come back. And we get one last bit of dialogue referencing the film's title of Never Say Never Again, which was created and coined by Connery's wife. And then a moment to break the fourth wall, Connery winks at the camera, and then we have a flash of the 007 logo framing it to take us into the end titles, which interestingly are in a red title font that seem very much like what we would see at the end of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which fits, of course, because this film was made between Raiders and Temple and features most of the Indiana Jones crew, from the cinematographer to the AD and second unit director and so on. And Lani Hall's title song comes back for a in-title version. So that closes Never Say Never Again. It is a interesting experience. Again, here we see Riku Browning was in charge of the underwater effects. Again, he worked on Thunderball. David Tomlin's all-important credit, first AD, but doing a lot more than being a first AD. The film is unquestionably a mixed bag. It has many great ideas that either just get shortchanged or left or overlooked or ignored or simply forgotten about. And again, it ultimately feels very much of its time. It is extremely dated in not necessarily good ways, but I think you can eventually come to terms with it. Again, with multiple rewatches, it sort of becomes one of those films you come to, you know what you're going in for, and you look for the positives you remember. And I do think there are some really nice flourishes for diehard Bond fans, especially the specific satirical jabs at the official series and the distinct pulls from Fleming material. Like original Fleming novel Bond has little flourishes here and there that I think were put there to sort of be maybe an olive branch to Bond fans. But the primary idea is this is all about Connery coming back and being this older Bond character, which is a great idea. It was a great concept, and I still would really love to read the original Lorenzo Semple Jr. draft, because I think it'd be interesting to compare. And also, they should have taken more time to develop the script. Since they were rewriting it, they should have given the second team of writers enough time to develop things. And ultimately, a lot of this can be laid down to the fact that Jack Schwartzman was not a film producer, and his inexperience in this field really wound up shortchanging the film and complicating everything at every turn whenever normal, natural problems would pop up. Everyone, including especially Connery himself, acknowledged this film did not turn out the way that anybody wanted it to. It was a disappointment that managed to do good business at the box office and get good to decent enough reviews. Again, surprisingly better than what you would think. But it's strange. This film eventually starts to charm you in a way. It wins you over, and I've never considered it a bad film. I've never hated it. I've just always considered it this strange outlier. Again, this idea I came up with, it becomes more of a film that is a Bond film made by people who think they know what a Bond film is and what a Bond film should be, but have nothing to do with Bond films. It's just, it's like a Bond film made by a different studio that thinks it understands the ingredients that make a Bond film. And they've got Sean Connery, and it's going to be a bit more serious. It's not going to have tons of gadgets, but they throw all this stuff in there, and the script doesn't quite work. The story doesn't quite work. But ultimately, you have core elements there that really are solid. The best of them being Connery's performance, which is absolutely magnificent and fully engaged, and the villain performance of Largo by Klaus Maria Brandauer. So it is a film that is a ever perplexing thing to return to. Some people absolutely love it. Some people hate it. Some people consider it officially tied to the Bond films, and others can't stand it. So that ends the film, and really, it is an experience I think every James Bond fan should have, or anyone who's getting into the official film series should look at the two unofficial films and look at their production history, and that alone in and of itself is really taking a master class in how a story can develop over time and be pushed and pulled in different ways. And it is really striking to compare 1965's Thunderball to this film, released in 1983, 18 years later, and also look at the original 1961 Thunderball novel that Ian Fleming wrote. And then also, again, the various bits of script drafts that were done by Fleming and Kevin McClory, and especially Jack Whittingham. I cannot recommend and stress how important it is to read The Battle for Bond, written by Robert Sellers. That is the book that goes into the entire Thunderball saga and the Kevin McClory story. If any of this has been fascinating to you or interesting at all, and you have not read The Battle for Bond, you absolutely must go and do yourself a favor and read it immediately. You will not be able to put it down. It really goes into material that most of us Bond fans sort of knew about, but no one had ever gone into that level of detail before Robert Sellers did. He also wrote an essential book on Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman's producing partnership, which is also highly recommended. So the film Never Say Never Again is it has a long gestating history before even the film was a go concept. Once Jack Schwartzman came into the picture, there are many things I didn't even get to cover in this commentary track. Again, I am just barely scratching the surface in these and merely giving you my own personal impression as the film unspools, trying to give bits of production factoids and my own personal opinions and things I've felt over the years rewatching these films an ungodly number of times as the film goes, and trying to do scene analysis and keep my train of thought as I'm trying to keep up with the film as well. Never Say Never Again is a film I've really come around on. I don't think it's a great film. I never have, and I never will. I don't think anybody really will. I'm always bewildered by the people who automatically loop it in with the rest of the Bond films and consider it not just a James Bond film, but there are people, great fans of this film, who consider it a very good film, and I find that quite bizarre, which, of course, some people might say it sounds crazy coming from me because I am an avowed diehard fan of the 1967 spoof Casino Royale film. That film, though, embraces its differences, I feel, whereas this one tries to be different from the official Eon films, but winds up in a lot of places almost being a pale imitation of the John Glenn era of Bond. I think obviously they had seen For Your Eyes Only in 1981, and obviously had seen some Bond material. They did look at Thunderball a bit, but then, tried to, Kirshner said he looked at it once and then didn't want to see it again to not have himself be influenced, which is correct, but the big problem was the fact that they were hampered by the legal battles and the constant scrutiny that got to the point where even individual lines were being scrutinized in court due to the legal hurdles that Eon was throwing up, due to understandably Cubby Broccoli being fearful of a rival Bond production. But ultimately, they did have the necessary rights that, Kevin McClory did have the rights to remake Thunderball. And I just think they should have embraced more of that. Let's just be completely different. And they really could have done Fleming's Bond if they wanted to, which we had not gotten. The 80s films were trying to be more Fleming-esque and did work on that idea using Fleming's short story elements and other Fleming bits that hadn't been used. But of course, it was still a James Bond film. What they could have done with Never Say Never Again is done Fleming's Bond. But really, in 1983, they couldn't do that either because the public expected a James Bond film. They expected an Eon film. They knew Connery was coming back, and that's what the marketing campaign was built around. That's what the whole film word of mouth was. Oh my God, Connery's coming back. This is going to be amazing. But people went in expecting a Connery Eon James Bond film, and they couldn't do that, which is really one of the major things that led most people in studios to say they didn't want to do this project, that it wasn't a good idea. So really the film was stuck between a rock and a hard place in more ways than one, and I think they should have followed Connery's instincts of wanting to play this older Bond and played it up a bit more. I think had the replacement writers been given enough time to finesse, particularly the second half of the film, and inject it with more of that wittiness and that humor and that sort of knowing stuff that we see in the first half, I think it would play better. I think it would make the climax feel less run-of-the-mill and flat and dull. Which are key descriptive words that I would use to describe this film in its entirety. When I first saw this as a kid growing up, I knew it was a quasi-weird sort of outlier. I didn't know the whole back history behind it, but I had sort of an idea. But the first time I ever saw any of this film, I didn't know what to make of it. And it felt in a lot of places like a TV movie, which was bizarre when you look at the cast and crew. And then you realize it's Irvin Kershner coming off of right after directing The Empire Strikes Back. But looking at Kershner's career outside of Empire and the production history, he did do a lot of reworking of things and requesting rewrites and things, and was known in the industry for always making constant changes, and that his productions would usually go over schedule and over budget because of this constant reworking of things. That's why I really want to read the original Lorenzo Semple Jr. material, because I would be very interested to see what his original approach was once Connery signed on and worked with him. And I want to see what he wrote with Connery's input, because I think it would be very interesting to compare that to the eventual film we got. Again, I think Kershner did bring some interesting things to the film. I think that he had a lot of the right instincts. And I do think he has some good directorial flourishes in the film, and I think he really did well in directing Connery and Brandauer, and particularly their scenes together. He did have a tough time with Kim Basinger being very inexperienced and being a young actress, and with the production being crazy and there being no communication and the whole film going off the rails and the production turning into a bit of a runaway nightmare. And everyone was pretty much scrambling just to get the film done. But I do think that he probably was not the best choice overall. I do really like the idea of Richard Donner doing it. I think that was, at that time, a perfect idea. But I do think it's telling that Donner felt, probably not just for himself, but like a lot of the industry, he felt that it was not a good idea, and so he bowed out. I don't know the full list of other directors they may have considered, but this isn't to harp on about my feelings on Kershner's directions of the film for a long while, but I do think the film obviously would have been better had they been able to finish the darn script. That is perhaps the single biggest problem. It's an even bigger problem than the legal hassles and the constant scrutiny and having to specifically stick to the 1961 Thunderball novel, and you can't use anything from the films. That's the biggest problem. That and Jack Schwartzman being kind of non-existent on the set and having to do the legal battles and not being there as the producer should be to take care of problems when they arose, and it falling on the star and the first AD's shoulders to basically take over the role of the producer. And apparently relations got so bad that Connery refused to even speak to Jack Schwartzman. I do kind of feel bad for Schwartzman in a way, because this was his first film as a producer, and he did have to wind up financing the last bit of the production out of his own pocket. And he was doing this as a first-timer. He didn't have experience as a producer. He got in over his head in a lot of ways. So it turned out to be a raw deal for most everyone. Ultimately, the film is forever a mixed bag and is now looked at as a curio, but it's becoming more and more obscure because the film is now in out-of-print status. So eventually, I think it in Casino Royale 67 will become even more of a distant curio that only the super diehard Bond fanatics are going to search out and seek out and examine and be perplexed by. I do feel like Casino 67, it is a film that does kind of require multiple viewings. I think you have to become really accustomed to its particular rhythms and its slower style and things like that. I think that once you see it a handful of times, I think that you start to accept the shortcomings, and you start to just go with the film, and you give it more credit. I think, at least I know I have. I know the first time I just thought I've never known quite what to make of it. It is a strange outlier. It is a compromised film. And I don't think it's fair to really say it's a bad film, because it never really got to sink or float on its own merits. It had all this people's preconceived notions about Connery coming back, the whole Thunderball saga with Kevin McClory, the situation with Jack Schwartzman, the script not being finished and being rewritten and pulled apart multiple times, and the production going screwy and having to meet a hard release date, and then going up against Octopussy and the press focusing on the Battle of the Bonds and all that nonsense. It's just a film I think you have to look at for yourself, make up your own mind about it, and ultimately there are good things in it. The strongest of them being the central Connery performance, which is absolutely fantastic. He's fully committed in every single moment and seems to be enjoying himself, which is really interesting when you think about the fact that he is much older and the production was just turned into nasty business all around. It was not an enjoyable film to make. And I do think he is matched by Klaus Maria Brandauer, who isn't spoken about enough as for his Largo performance here. I think he's absolutely spellbinding every time he's on screen. I wish he was in the film more, and I wish the climax was better and really gave us that emotional payoff between Bond and villain that we did get in the '65 Thunderball. Ultimately, a lot of Bond personnel were asked to be involved in this film. They did ask Peter Hunt to direct the film. He declined out of deference to Broccoli and the Eon series. Connery asked Tom Mankiewicz to come on and write on the film, which I think would have been great because I do feel Tom Mankiewicz was a genius. But Mankiewicz also, rightly out of loyalty to Cubby Broccoli and Eon, declined Sean's asking him to come write on the film. There were other people who were approached and also said the same thing and declined. Norman Wanstall did come out of retirement to work on the sound effects for the film, apparently at Sean's request, and did sort of get the Cubby Broccoli's blessing because he too felt it was sort of being disloyal, but he did do that, and so you do have at least one of the original core Bond team from the beginning who is also in Never Say Never Again with Connery. Ultimately, Never Say Never Again is a film that every single time I see it, I wish it was better. I see things that I would have done differently, or I feel that they could have done differently had they had more time. I feel that there are many great jokes that fly over people's heads or could have been executed better. I think there's great stuff for diehard Bond fans. I think the best gags are, of course, Connery's ability to deliver the one-liners with aplomb and underplaying all of them. I adore the Rowan Atkinson, Nigel Small-Fawcett characters being the super fuss budget who is caught up and suddenly in a world of spies and doesn't like it. I like the knocks at Bond being sort of the Cold War dinosaur. And the references to his age, they're not overdone, but they're definitely there. A View to a Kill would interestingly play on this, of course, Roger Moore being 57 at the time, but in that film, they do it intrinsically. They never overstate or make a specific joke about Bond's age, but you feel Bond's age intrinsically, and I think that adds to the tension of that film really brilliantly. And they don't spell it out the way that it's done throughout this film. So I think maybe I don't know, but I think they were a little bit inspired by the idea of the older Bond in this film, and they decided to sort of incorporate it into that film's script, but done intrinsically, but also to highlight the fact that Roger Moore was definitely an older Bond in that film. I also, again, would like to point out, I think they should have maybe taken more inspiration from the John Gardner James Bond novels of that era. I think that his first few novels in the 1980s are his strongest James Bond novels, and what's always fascinated me most was particularly how he brought Ian Fleming's James Bond of the 50s into the modernized world of the 1980s, and how his Bond in those novels was able to maintain his old ways and become accustomed to the new technology of the 80s. the film is sort of hitting on some of that idea, but it never really goes into it. And I wish it would have, because we would be able to feel Bond's character more. That's what it's trying to do. And again, I think we would get more of that had they just had time to finish the damn script, which they never did. Again, that and Schwartzman not being a real film producer is the film's Achilles heel. It has many, admittedly, but those are the key ones that really prove its undoing. And then to close, I say all of this, but I now have a certain admiration for the film. It's taken a number of years, and I've never out and out disliked it, but I've now become accustomed to the kind of flatness and the slower rhythm of the editing and the feel of the film. And you come in for Connery's performance, that does not disappoint, and he is matched by Brandauer's villain performance, and we get some nice little bits and some nice scenes with Fatima Blush, and some nice jokes, and Nigel Smallfawcett, and some Connery one-liners, and some nice Bond character moments too. So it's not a total loss. It's a film that, again, everybody's going to have to come to and make up their own mind on it. And I think most non-Bond fans are going to be very perplexed. Either they'll just like it as a regular movie from the 80s, or they're just going to wonder what the fuss is and think it looks like a TV movie. People are just going to have to make up their own minds about it now. But again, with its out-of-print status and its unofficial outsider sort of placement, it's becoming more and more of an obscure curio. So Never Say Never Again is, again, a film I think will always and forever be a mixed bag, but one that continues to fascinate me in odd ways, and I find little gems buried in the surface. So it is a film I think everyone should return to, and I think diehard Bond fans will find many little nuggets scattered throughout if they're willing to really dig for them, because they are there. But it is a film whose shortcomings are proudly worn on its sleeve, and if you can get on board with that, if you can get on board with the film and you know all of its shortcomings already and you come back to it, I think you then have the ability to just get on with it and enjoy the good elements that are in there. So with that, thank you ever so much for listening. If you made it this far in my babbling on Never Say Never Again, I truly appreciate it. Again, these commentaries are me just spitballing as the film unspools, and I am so grateful for all the feedback I've gotten on these. It means the world to know that anyone listens to my babbling on James Bond. Again, this is not a definitive history of the film. I am just merely scratching the surface as I simply have a nice one-sided chat with all of you as the film Never Say Never Again plays you out. So with that, as always, I am very humbly yours, the motion picture analyst. I'm all yours.